Hey there. Tonight we drift into the quiet, measured world of county courthouses across America. Those unassuming yet steadfast centers of law, administration, and community life. We'll move slowly through centuries, tracing the deliberate spread of these buildings, from the earliest colonial meetinghouses to the grand neoclassical courthouses of the 20th century, and even to the modern structures that still hum with civic rhythm today. So, before we settle into this long and gentle journey, dim your lights, let your shoulders loosen, perhaps turn on a soft fan or a quiet night sound to fill the background with a subtle hum. Take a deep breath and allow the slow unfolding of history to carry you along. Each courthouse, each county, each town we visit will tell a story not of sudden drama, but of steady, persistent human effort and the quiet establishment of order. If you enjoy these slow journeys through history, consider subscribing to the channel. It's a gentle way to keep exploring the subtle, fascinating rhythms of the past, and you won't miss a single quiet step along the way. Tonight we move not with haste, but with patient observation, letting ourselves notice the textures of weathered brick, the shadow of a cupola in the afternoon sun, the gentle footfalls of people walking across a courthouse square. Let's begin our journey, following the careful footsteps of settlers, builders and administrators, and the enduring rhythm of civic life that has quietly shaped communities across America. In the early decades of European settlement along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States, the landscape was at once formidable and quietly insistent. Forests stretched in slow, unbroken waves, rivers traced meandering paths through lowlands, and the soil, punctuated by marshes, rocks and glades, dictated the rhythms of human settlement with a tacit authority that no colonist could fully master. Within this environment, the first settlers, English, Dutch and later Swedish, French and German, found themselves confronted not only with the laborious demands of subsistence, but with the subtle, yet pressing, need to establish order, governance and social cohesion in a place where neither had previously existed. In the earliest days there were no municipal offices, no brick courthouses to punctuate a town square, no centrally placed symbols of legal authority. Instead, the settlers' relationship with law and governance was mediated through the structures that they could construct, occupy, and crucially maintain. The earliest administrative structures were inherently provisional, shaped by circumstance rather than by deliberate architectural vision. Meetinghouses, often timber-framed and weathered by coastal winds, served multiple roles simultaneously. In some towns, a single hall might function as a church on Sundays, a venue for town meetings on weekdays, and a courtroom whenever disputes demanded formal adjudication. The floorboards, worn by generations of boots and the occasional hurried flight of children, creaked in quiet testimony to countless hours of deliberation, negotiation, and minor quarrels. Within these spaces, settlers recorded property transfers, heard disputes between neighbors over fences or livestock, and documented the births, marriages, and deaths that defined the ebb and flow of human life in a new colony. The meetinghouse was thus a microcosm of early colonial governance, embodying both spiritual and secular authority, a place where the rhythms of daily life intersected with the nascent machinery of law. Taverns, too, assumed an unexpectedly significant role in early administration. Though primarily social spaces, they were the venues where itinerant magistrates, or justices of the peace might convene, where petitions were read aloud, and where community consensus was often sought before a more formal legal decision could be rendered. In some cases, the tavern's hearth, constantly smoldering with a low persistent flame, offered warmth and a backdrop of steady domesticity against which civic decisions were slowly, methodically debated. Wooden beams darkened by smoke, tables scarred by knives and ink stains, and the subtle odor of fermenting grains all contributed to the sensory environment of early legal life, an environment in which law was both a practical necessity and a collective, almost ritualized social performance. Church halls, particularly in Puritan New England, provided a parallel yet equally vital venue for early governance. Here, the congregation's elders often assumed administrative roles, ensuring that moral and legal codes intertwined seamlessly. Sermons could segue into discussions of local ordinances, and discipline within the congregation mirrored, in quiet and deliberate fashion, the community's expectations for civil conduct. In these spaces, settlers cultivated a tacit understanding that law was inseparable from daily life, that governance was not merely an abstract system, but a living, breathing network of obligations, behaviors, and rituals. Every creaking floorboard, every frost-laden windowpane, every carefully inked ledger page contributed to a sense of permanence amid the surrounding uncertainty of frontier existence. This period of early colonial governance was marked not by grand gestures or monumental edifices, but by the patient, almost imperceptible rhythms of daily life. Settlers awoke with the sun, labored in fields or forests, and returned to spaces where law, commerce, and sociality intermingled seamlessly. In a quiet, meditative sense, the first courthouses were not buildings alone, but an interplay of human presence, environmental circumstance, and the slow accumulation of records, rituals, and authority. Every property dispute settled under the low beams of a meeting house, every marriage recorded in a simple ledger, and every dispute mediated over the warmth of a tavern hearth, incrementally built the scaffolding for formal governance structures to come. Geography played a subtle, unyielding role in the placement and design of these early administrative centers. Rivers, often the arteries of transport and trade, dictated the seating of meeting houses. Proximity to fertile land, mills, or ferry crossings influenced accessibility. The builders, whether skilled carpenters brought from England or untrained settlers improvising with local timber, made choices that were both pragmatic and symbolic. A tall gabled roof might signify authority or permanence, while a modest, squat structure communicated the humility and communal nature of local governance. Each choice, however minor it might have seemed, contributed to a slowly evolving architectural language that would over the next century mature into the recognizable forms of American county courthouses. Record-keeping, though often overlooked in conventional histories, was central to this early stage. Parchment and ink, preserved in simple wooden chests or modest cupboards, became silent witnesses to the slow accumulation of civic life. Property transactions, wills, town meeting minutes, and criminal proceedings, all recorded in careful, deliberate script, formed a foundation of continuity that would allow communities to endure beyond the fragility of individual memory. These records, kept in spaces both humble and persistent, exemplified the quiet dedication of settlers to the principles of law and order, even when resources were scarce and the surrounding landscape was unforgiving. By the late 17th century, the cumulative effect of these provisional structures was evident. Settlements that had begun as clusters of homes and farms now exhibited a discernible civic rhythm. Towns were organized around meeting houses or central halls, and settlers understood the predictable cadence of legal and administrative life. The space of governance, though modest and mutable, had become integral to community identity. Each building, each ledger, each deliberative gathering reinforced a sense of permanence in a world that was otherwise marked by uncertainty, disease, and the relentless demands of frontier survival. Even in their simplicity, these early colonial structures laid the groundwork for what would later become formal county courthouses. They demonstrated the enduring need for spaces where law could be enacted, where disputes could be mediated, and where community life could be organized with deliberate care. The quiet, almost imperceptible labor of record-keeping, architectural improvisation, and civic ritual in these meeting houses, taverns, and church halls gradually accumulated into the structural and symbolic foundations for the courthouses that would come to define counties across America. In contemplating the early colonial foundations of county governance, one is struck not by grandeur or spectacle, but by the measured, persistent rhythms of human life. The slow carving of timber, the careful inking of a ledger, the steady murmur of voices negotiating justice in spaces both communal and sacred. These were the small, deliberate acts that established the quiet continuity of law and order, the invisible scaffolding upon which centuries of civic architecture would rise, and the enduring heartbeat of communities yet to come. By the latter half of the 17th century, the scattered settlements along the eastern seaboard of North America had begun to evolve beyond mere clusters of homesteads and trading posts into organized, formally recognized administrative regions. The initial decades of colonial life had been dominated by improvisation. Communities adapted to the immediate demands of survival, occasionally establishing rudimentary meeting houses, taverns or church halls to serve multiple civic functions. However, as the population grew, the demands of governance became increasingly complex, necessitating a shift from these provisional arrangements to something more structured and enduring. It was during this period, in colonies such as Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, that the concept of counties, as formal units of territorial administration, began to crystallize, providing the framework upon which the architecture of law and civic authority would rest for generations to come. The creation of counties was not merely a bureaucratic exercise, it represented a deliberate attempt to reconcile the practical needs of governance with the realities of geography, population distribution, and the slow rhythms of travel and communication. Roads were primitive, often little more than widened paths between farms and rivers, and travel could be laborious, hazardous, and weather-dependent. As such, counties were designed to be geographically manageable, their boundaries drawn with careful consideration of natural features such as rivers, hills, and forests, which could both facilitate and hinder travel. The county, then, was more than a line on a map. It was a reflection of the physical and human landscape, a recognition that effective administration required proximity, accessibility, and a discernible center where justice could be rendered and records maintained. At the heart of each county was its administrative center, commonly known as the county seat. The designation of a county seat was often a slow, deliberate process, negotiated between settlers, colonial officials, and occasionally landowners, who had a vested interest in the positioning of civic infrastructure. Once a location was chosen, the need for a permanent, recognizable space for legal and administrative functions became urgent. The early meeting houses and taverns, once sufficient for small gatherings, were increasingly inadequate for the growing population and the expanding range of legal responsibilities. The county seat required buildings that could accommodate court proceedings, record keeping, and public assemblies, creating a new architectural and social focal point within the county. These structures, though still modest by later standards, embodied the emerging authority of county governance, and served as tangible symbols of law, stability, and civic order. In Virginia, for instance, counties such as Henrico and York were established as early as the mid-17th century, with county courts meeting in modest brick or timber structures that reflected both the resources available and the aesthetic sensibilities of the time. These early courthouses were typically simple rectangular buildings, often 1 or 2 stories, featuring large rooms for court proceedings, and smaller spaces for record storage and administrative offices. Windows were placed sparingly, allowing light to enter while retaining warmth, and large chimneys punctuated the buildings, providing necessary heat during the long, often harsh winters. Floors were usually wide planks, worn smooth by the passage of feet over years of sessions, while walls were adorned with functional items, maps, ledgers, and occasionally clocks, signaling the persistent passage of time and the careful regulation of civic life. In Massachusetts, the establishment of counties followed a slightly different trajectory, influenced by Puritan notions of community, moral order, and participatory governance. The town meeting tradition, already well entrenched, blended with the emerging county structures, creating spaces where citizens could observe, participate in, and occasionally influence the administration of justice. County courthouses in this region often bore a dual character. They were simultaneously sites of formal legal authority and extensions of communal life, accommodating not only trials and record keeping, but also public meetings, announcements, and occasionally, markets or fairs. Here, architecture was modest yet purposeful, with central halls, elevated platforms for magistrates, and galleries that allowed the community to witness proceedings without interfering with their solemnity. Every beam, window, and plank contributed to a subtle, almost meditative rhythm, guiding both officials and citizens through the slow cadence of local governance. The early 18th century saw an increasing emphasis on permanence in county buildings, reflecting both growing populations and a maturing sense of civic identity. As settlements stabilized and wealth accumulated, counties invested in more durable materials, such as brick and stone, moving away from the simple timber frames of earlier decades. Courthouses were carefully sited, often in the geographic or symbolic center of the county, ensuring that they were visible, accessible, and unmistakable in their purpose. Their facades were plain but dignified, signaling the gravity of the proceedings within, while interiors were organized to facilitate the multiple functions of governance: courtrooms for adjudication, offices for clerks and record keepers, and spaces for public assembly and deliberation. The slow, deliberate expansion of county governance also reflected the layered, often negotiated nature of authority in colonial America. County courts were presided over by justices of the peace, frequently drawn from prominent local families, who balanced the interests of the colonial government with the expectations of settlers. These officials convened regular sessions to address criminal cases, civil disputes, taxation, infrastructure maintenance, and a host of other civic concerns. In doing so, they relied heavily on written records, minutes and ledgers, each meticulously maintained in the county seat. The process was painstaking, meticulous and slow-moving, reflecting both the limitations of the period and a conscious effort to anchor governance in careful documentation and procedural consistency. It was within these measured, almost ritualized acts that the foundation for the enduring American courthouse system was laid. Equally important was the integration of civic life with the county seat. As more settlers moved into the hinterlands, the courthouse became not merely a site of administration, but a social nucleus, a place where the rhythms of community life unfolded in parallel with the demands of law. Fairs, elections, religious gatherings, and informal marketplaces often clustered around the courthouse, creating a gentle, continuous hum of human activity. In the quiet moments between court sessions, the space resonated with the subtle sounds of daily life: the shuffle of feet on wooden floors, the scratching of quills on parchment, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional creak of heavy doors opening to admit townsfolk seeking counsel, petitioning for justice, or simply passing through. In this way, the county courthouse became a locus, not only of authority, but of lived experience, embedding governance into the texture of community existence. By the end of the early 18th century, counties across the American colonies had established a recognizable pattern: a geographically defined region, a designated county seat, and a permanent structure serving as the hub of legal and administrative life. This framework would endure, gradually evolving to accommodate population growth, architectural trends, and the shifting needs of governance. The birth of county governance was thus both practical and symbolic: practical in providing structure and adjudication for a dispersed and growing population, and symbolic in asserting the presence of law, order, and civic identity in an expansive and often unpredictable landscape. It was within this quiet, deliberate expansion that the architectural and administrative foundations of the American courthouse were firmly planted. The story of early county governance is therefore not one of sudden triumphs or spectacular events, but of measured continuity, patient negotiation, and careful construction, both of buildings and of the social and legal frameworks they contained. The establishment of counties transformed the scattered, improvised settlements of colonial America into organized, administratively coherent regions, each centered on a courthouse that embodied authority, permanence, and civic identity. In the slow unfolding of these developments, one can trace the origins of a system that would persist for centuries, quietly shaping the contours of American life, and leaving a legacy visible, enduring, and quietly commanding in the towns and counties that still bear the imprint of those earliest foundations. In the quiet decades following the formal establishment of counties across the American colonies, the architectural language of governance began to take shape, but in a manner markedly different from the grand, imposing edifices of Europe. Early courthouses were conceived not to impress with monumental scale or ornate decoration, but to embody a restrained dignity and a functional authority, carefully balanced with the practical limitations of frontier life. They were, in many ways, quiet declarations of permanence, modest structures of wood or brick, often rectangular, whose simplicity belied the weight of the legal, administrative, and symbolic responsibilities they contained. The choice of materials was rarely a matter of aesthetic preference alone. It was dictated by necessity, availability, and environmental circumstance. Timber, abundant in forests that stretched uninterrupted along the eastern seaboard, was the most accessible and versatile building material. Local carpenters, often working without detailed architectural plans, relied on time-honored techniques brought from England or improvised through observation and necessity. Beams were hewn from mature trees, walls framed with mortise and tenon joinery, and floors laid with wide planks, sometimes unfinished, sometimes planed smooth by careful handwork. In regions where clay deposits were sufficient, bricks were molded and fired in small local kilns, producing a slightly uneven yet serviceable material that signified a step toward permanence and resilience against the elements. In some cases, stone, though labor-intensive to quarry and transport, was used for foundations or chimneys, adding weight and a sense of stability to the structure. The layouts of early courthouses were equally deliberate, reflecting both function and symbolic authority. Most buildings were rectangular, with a central hall or courtroom occupying the majority of the interior space. This room, often the only significant chamber, was designed to accommodate public gatherings, judicial proceedings, and administrative work. In the absence of extensive office complexes or bureaucratic wings, smaller side rooms or lofts might serve as storage for ledgers, seals, and official documents, or as private spaces for magistrates to deliberate. The simplicity of these layouts allowed for clear lines of sight, facilitating both the orderly conduct of proceedings and the communal oversight of justice. Windows, often tall but narrow, admitted light, while preserving warmth and privacy, their modest panes reflecting a practical economy rather than decorative intent. Yet the simplicity of these buildings was not merely functional, it carried symbolic weight. Even in their unadorned forms, early courthouses conveyed authority. A rectangular structure with a centered entrance, a modest gable, and a prominent chimney signaled stability and permanence in a landscape otherwise dominated by impermanent, hastily constructed dwellings. The very act of raising a dedicated building for civic functions, rather than relying solely on meeting houses or taverns, announced the presence of law, governance, and structured order. In many ways, the courthouse became a quiet landmark, its physical presence communicating without words the solemnity and constancy of legal authority. The natural surroundings of each courthouse also shaped its form and placement. Many were sited on elevated ground, gentle rises that provided visibility across the surrounding settlement and subtly reinforced the symbolic prominence of the law. In other cases, courthouses were located near rivers, crossroads, or emerging town centers, ensuring accessibility while simultaneously aligning with the rhythms of commerce and travel. The architecture itself often responded to the climate and environment. Steeply pitched roofs allowed snow and rain to run clear, deep eaves offered shade in the summer, and robust chimneys ensured warmth during long winters. Every design choice, while primarily practical, was also imbued with a quiet symbolism, reflecting a careful balance between human needs, environmental realities, and the assertion of civic order. Within these walls, symbolism was reinforced by spatial hierarchy. The magistrate or justice occupied a raised platform or bench, overseeing the courtroom with a calm authority that subtly emphasized the structured nature of law. Citizens and litigants occupied lower benches or open floor space, their proximity to the proceedings signifying both accessibility and deference. In this simple arrangement, the architecture itself taught a lesson. Law was constant, impartial, and central to communal life. Even without ornamental flourishes or columns of marble, the courthouse communicated through proportion, placement, and layout, quietly instructing all who entered in the principles of governance and justice. Construction itself was a slow, deliberate process, reinforcing the symbolic weight of the building. Timber had to be felled, seasoned, and shaped. Bricks molded and fired, foundations laid with care, roofs raised with coordinated effort. This deliberate labor, often shared among settlers, imbued the courthouse with a communal significance beyond its legal function. Each plank, each brick, each carefully carved beam became part of a living record of collective effort and civic intent. In a sense, the courthouse was not only a structure of wood or brick, but a testament to the community's commitment to enduring law, order, and social cohesion. The aesthetic restraint of early courthouses also reflected a philosophical understanding of authority. Unlike European palaces or government edifices, These buildings were not intended to dominate through grandeur or extravagance. Instead, their authority was subtle, derived from solidity, clarity, and the unspoken assurance that governance was constant, impartial, and persistent. A rectangular brick courthouse with tall, narrow windows, a sturdy door, and a simple gable roof might seem unremarkable at first glance, yet to the settlers of the time, it represented a profound shift, the transformation of disorder into structured, recognizable civic order, a tangible anchor in the shifting landscapes of the New World. Over time, even minor embellishments became symbolic markers. A cupola, or small belfry, often added to the roofline, could signal the presence of a courtroom or civic assembly hall, offering both a visual focal point for the town and a subtle auditory marker when a bell tolled to summon officials or citizens. These elements, though restrained, contributed to a growing architectural vocabulary that quietly communicated civic values: stability, visibility, accessibility, and solemnity. Similarly, exterior porches or steps provided transitional space between the everyday life of the town and the formal proceedings within, allowing citizens to gather, wait, and prepare themselves for the careful, measured experience of engaging with law and governance. In essence, the architectural simplicity of early American courthouses was inseparable from their symbolic function. Each building embodied a dual purpose: to provide practical space for the administration of law, and to communicate with subtle clarity the enduring authority of civic order. Settlers and builders, constrained by materials, labor, and environment, achieved a quiet elegance, a calm dignity that would resonate through centuries. These early structures, modest though they were, established a pattern of architectural restraint, purposeful layout, and symbolic communication that would profoundly influence the evolution of county courthouses in the years to come. Ultimately, the early courthouses were both physical and symbolic anchors, reflecting the values, constraints, and aspirations of the communities that raised them. They were quietly monumental in their restraint, deliberate in their construction, and enduring in their presence. They marked the transition from provisional civic arrangements to formalized governance, providing a visual and spatial representation of law, order, and community cohesion. In every plank of timber, every fired brick, and every carefully placed window, the early courthouse communicated a slow, persistent message that law was central, authority was constant, and the community itself had chosen to invest in structures that would endure, both materially and symbolically, across generations. In the quiet years following the establishment of formal county governance, the courthouse gradually assumed a role far beyond that of a mere legal or administrative building. While it undeniably functioned as the locus for court proceedings, record-keeping, and official business, it also became the subtle heartbeat of community life, a place around which the daily rhythms of towns and settlements unfolded. The courthouse, modest in architectural scale, yet commanding in symbolic weight, was simultaneously a site of authority and a stage for communal interaction, and an anchor for civic identity and social cohesion in an otherwise dispersed and evolving landscape. For the average settler, the courthouse was often the most tangible manifestation of civic organization, the point at which personal, familial, and commercial concerns intersected with law and governance. It was here that disputes over property boundaries, debt, or inheritance were heard, decisions were made, and records were carefully inscribed and preserved. Yet the courthouse was rarely a place of constant activity, occupied solely for legal proceedings. Rather, its presence created a rhythm, a cycle of anticipation and engagement, as citizens came to town for scheduled court sessions, elections, and public meetings. These intervals, spaced over weeks or months, structured the social calendar of the county, subtly organizing the lives of settlers in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Election days, in particular, transformed the courthouse into a focal point of civic participation. In colonies such as Massachusetts and Virginia, county elections required that eligible men, typically landowners, gather to cast votes for local officials or representatives. These gatherings were deliberate, measured affairs, often accompanied by informal discussion, negotiation, and socializing before or after the formal proceedings. Citizens would traverse muddy roads, cross shallow streams, and ascend hills to reach the courthouse, carrying with them not only ballots and petitions but the accumulated experiences of daily life, news from distant farms, the outcomes of market exchanges, and word of local events. In this slow convergence, the courthouse became more than a legal hub. It became a stage upon which community life unfolded, a tangible symbol of the collective participation necessary for governance to function. Public announcements and proclamations also found their natural setting in the courthouse. Town criers, magistrates or clerks would read aloud notices regarding taxation, land grants, new ordinances, or upcoming communal events. These readings were often accompanied by the subtle rhythms of everyday life, the murmur of spectators standing on worn wooden steps, the occasional creak of hinges or floorboards, and the distant hum of activity from nearby farms, markets, and homes. The courthouse thus served as a bridge between official authority and the lived experiences of citizens, mediating information, expectation, and response with a deliberate, measured cadence. Markets and fairs, though seemingly secular in nature, were also drawn to the Courthouse Square in many early towns. The courthouse, often centrally located, created a natural gathering space where settlers could exchange goods, produce, and livestock, and where itinerant merchants or craftsmen could offer their services. These gatherings, occurring on court days or designated market days, imbued the courthouse with a quiet duality, a space of solemn legal authority intertwined with the gentle hum of social and economic life. All wooden stalls, simple tents, and wagon wheels punctuated the square, while voices, footsteps, and the occasional braying of animals created an ambient backdrop to the slower, more measured proceedings within the courthouse itself. In this way, the building mediated both formal and informal interactions, anchoring the community in time, place, and collective experience. The spatial design of early courthouses often reflected their multifunctional role. While the courtroom occupied the primary interior space, exterior areas and adjacent grounds were deliberately maintained to accommodate public gathering. All wide steps, modest porches, or small open yards allowed townsfolk to assemble without overcrowding the interior, facilitating observation, discussion, and preparation for participation in civic processes. Or within the courtroom, elevated benches for magistrates signaled authority, while galleries or benches for spectators allowed citizens to witness proceedings, reinforcing both transparency and communal oversight. Even the act of waiting, standing in line, observing a session, or simply lingering in the courtyard, became part of the rhythm of civic life, a quiet integration of everyday experience with formal governance. Religious and seasonal rhythms further intertwined with courthouse life. In New England, for instance, the town meeting tradition often overlapped with court sessions, blurring the distinction between civic and spiritual authority. Decisions about public works, road maintenance, or local ordinances might be announced immediately following religious observances or during communal gatherings. Similarly, seasonal markets and fairs were timed to coincide with periods of relative leisure in agrarian schedules, such as post-harvest or early spring, ensuring maximal participation and reinforcing the courthouse as a temporal anchor in the annual cycles of community life. Through these overlapping rhythms, the courthouse became a subtle, yet persistent structuring element, organizing social and economic patterns alongside its legal functions. The courthouse also provided a venue for conflict resolution and the cultivation of social norms. Disputes between neighbors, disagreements over land boundaries, and minor criminal offenses were addressed within its walls, often in proceedings that emphasized mediation, restitution, and careful deliberation. The slow, deliberate process of adjudication reinforced communal expectations and allowed the community to internalize the principles of justice and accountability. Citizens observing the proceedings absorbed lessons not merely through legal instruction, but through the quiet rituals of observation, patience, and participation. The courthouse in this sense became a silent teacher, shaping civic consciousness through its presence, procedure, and the understated weight of routine. Architectural simplicity and symbolic clarity reinforced the courthouse's role as a social nucleus. Its modest rectangular form, the prominent entrance, and the visible placement within a town or village communicated accessibility and authority simultaneously. Citizens intuitively understood the building's significance, approaching it with both respect and practical familiarity. Over time, the courthouse became a site where personal, social, and civic identities intertwined. It was where individuals conducted business, where neighbors observed one another's behavior, and where the broader rhythms of county governance were made tangible. Each creaking floorboard, each carefully inked ledger, and each step up to the courtroom contributed to an immersive lived experience of civic life, a quiet choreography of participation and observation that unfolded daily, weekly, and seasonally. In essence, the early county courthouse functioned as a nexus, linking law, governance, social interaction, and economic exchange. Its walls contained not only legal proceedings, but also the ebb and flow of communal life. Announcements read aloud, ballots cast, disputes mediated, goods exchanged, and rhythms of daily settlement observed. Through its presence and careful orchestration, the courthouse facilitated a sense of continuity, order, and communal identity, embedding the slow, deliberate processes of civic life into both space and consciousness. It was here, in these modest yet symbolically potent structures, that the quiet heartbeat of colonial and early American community life could be observed, measured, and appreciated, a persistent testament to the intertwined rhythms of law, society, and the human desire for stability and participation. As the 18th century progressed, the landscape of colonial America shifted gradually yet inexorably westward. Settlers, driven by the promise of fertile soil, abundant timber, and the elusive possibilities of autonomy, ventured beyond the narrow coastal strips where early towns had clustered. These movements were deliberate and cautious, reflecting the slow, careful calculus of survival in an unfamiliar and often unforgiving wilderness. In tandem with this geographic expansion, the structures of governance, so painstakingly established along the eastern seaboard, followed with deliberate method. The county courthouse, already a focal point in established towns, became an indispensable element in these new settlements, a symbol not only of authority, but of permanence and continuity in territories previously dominated by untamed forests, winding rivers, and the quiet, unbroken rhythms of nature. The establishment of new settlements was never a hasty affair. Surveyors and explorers would first map the terrain, noting the courses of rivers, the location of fords, and the quality of the soil. Natural boundaries such as ridges, streams, and valleys guided the drawing of prospective county lines, while strategic considerations, access to water, arable land, and trade routes, determined the placement of central administrative points. These early decisions, though often recorded in simple sketches and notes, bore a lasting impact on the geography of governance. It was within these carefully considered landscapes that the first frontier courthouses would eventually rise, modest structures whose presence quietly anchored the scattered populations of new counties, and symbolized the assertion of law and order in territories otherwise governed by distance, necessity, and informal agreements. The first courthouses on the frontier were pragmatic in their conception, yet deliberate in their symbolism. Often constructed of readily available timber, they were designed to meet the immediate needs of administration, legal adjudication, and community gathering. In some cases, the first court sessions were held in private homes or multi-purpose log structures, echoing the improvisatory practices of earlier colonial settlements. Over time, however, these temporary arrangements gave way to permanent buildings, usually rectangular in form, with central halls for court proceedings, and side rooms for records and administrative functions. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow and rain, chimneys rose to provide warmth during harsh winters, and modest windows allowed natural light to illuminate the proceedings within. Even in their simplicity, these structures embodied the authority of governance and the community's commitment to civic organization, serving as both functional spaces and symbolic markers in an otherwise undeveloped landscape. Travel and communication posed particular challenges in frontier counties, shaping both the placement and the function of courthouses. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, susceptible to seasonal flooding or erosion, and rivers could act as both conduits and barriers. Settlers, therefore, understood the importance of locating the courthouse at a point that maximized accessibility, while also asserting visibility and permanence. It was not uncommon for a courthouse to be sited at a central hill or along a crossroads, where its modest silhouette could be seen for miles, silently signaling the presence of civic order. The approach to these buildings, winding paths through forests, fords across streams, and narrow clearings opening onto a timber-framed facade, created a slow, almost ceremonial transition from wilderness to governance, subtly reinforcing the courthouse's symbolic authority even before one stepped across its threshold. The construction process itself was emblematic of the frontier's deliberate pace. Timber had to be felled, squared and joined, often by settlers who doubled as carpenters, laborers and civic participants. Bricks, if used, were molded and fired locally, requiring the establishment of temporary kilns and careful attention to weather and fuel. Foundations were dug by hand, stones lifted into place with rudimentary pulleys and levers, and roofs raised with coordinated effort. Every step demanded patience, precision, and communal effort. In this slow labor, settlers imbued their courthouses with a sense of permanence and shared ownership. The building was not merely a space for adjudication, it was a tangible manifestation of the community's investment in law, order, and continuity, a quiet monument to the deliberate rhythms of frontier life. Courthouses also functioned as nuclei for settlement planning and civic organization. Once established, these structures often influenced the layout of surrounding towns. Roads radiated outward, plots of land were surveyed and allocated, and modest shops, taverns and homes clustered nearby. The courthouse square became both a literal and figurative center, shaping social, economic and administrative interactions. Here settlers gathered for market days, town meetings, religious observances and civic celebrations, all while maintaining the courthouse's primary role as the locus of legal authority. The slow accumulation of these functions around the courthouse reinforced its centrality, gradually transforming it from a simple administrative building into the quiet heartbeat of the county. The frontier courthouse also served as a stabilizing force in regions characterized by mobility, uncertainty, and occasional conflict. Disputes over land, inheritance, or contracts were inevitable in newly settled areas, and the presence of a formal judicial space allowed for structured, predictable resolution. Magistrates and justices of the peace presided with calm deliberation, adhering to procedural norms that linked these remote communities to broader colonial and later state systems of law. In this way, the courthouse functioned not only as a venue for resolving immediate disputes, but as a medium through which settlers internalized the principles of governance, accountability, and civic responsibility. Its influence extended beyond its walls, subtly shaping behavior, expectations, and social cohesion throughout the county. Over decades, the spread of county courthouses mirrored the methodical expansion of settlement itself. Each new building was a marker of human presence, a claim not of conquest but of organized habitation and civic intent. While the structures were modest and their construction often slow, the effect was cumulative. A network of courthouses emerged across previously undeveloped lands, linking distant settlements through shared legal frameworks, administrative procedures, and communal norms. This deliberate spread of civic architecture created continuity in an otherwise dispersed frontier, transforming the wilderness into a series of interconnected spaces defined by both geography and law. Even as these courthouses rose, they were attentive to the natural environment. Builders incorporated local materials, adapted to topography, and responded to seasonal variations. Roofs were pitched to handle snow, walls insulated with available resources, and sites chosen to avoid flooding or erosion. In this attention to environment, the frontier courthouse exemplified a dialogue between human intention and natural circumstance, mediating the rhythms of law and governance with the quiet persistence of local adaptation. Ultimately, the expansion of the frontier and the concurrent spread of courthouses represent a story of deliberate, measured growth. These buildings, simple yet symbolic, functional yet enduring, were more than administrative spaces. They were anchors of civic life, physical embodiments of law and social order, and markers of communal aspiration. Each courthouse, rising in a clearing, beside a river, or atop a modest hill, spoke quietly of permanence, deliberation, and human intent in the midst of the vast and sometimes indifferent landscape of the American frontier. In their slow proliferation, the frontier courthouses laid the foundations for the network of county governance that would define American life for centuries, a testament to the careful, methodical rhythms of settlement, construction, and civic organization. As the 18th century drew to a close, the American colonies found themselves at the threshold of profound transformation. The political, social, and economic tensions that had been quietly accumulating over decades, taxation without representation, disputes over trade regulation, and the gradual imposition of British authority, culminated in a revolutionary upheaval that would reshape the very foundations of governance. Within this upheaval, county courthouses assumed a new, multifaceted role. They became sites not only for adjudication and administration, but also for revolutionary organization, civic mobilization, and the cautious experimentation with the principles of self-governance that would define the fledgling United States. The courthouse, already established as a center of legal authority and community life, was uniquely suited to accommodate the practical demands of revolutionary activity. Its central location within a county, combined with its symbolic weight as a seat of law and order, made it a natural gathering place for committees of correspondence, local militias, and revolutionary councils. In towns across Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and beyond, citizens would converge on the courthouse square to deliberate, plan, and enact measures that challenged the authority of distant colonial governors, while simultaneously asserting a commitment to local autonomy. These gatherings were deliberate, slow-moving affairs, often unfolding over hours or days, and they relied upon the courthouse as a stable and recognizable venue that lent legitimacy and gravitas to the proceedings. Within the walls of the courthouse, revolutionary committees conducted a variety of essential administrative functions. Records of loyalty oaths, petitions, and resolutions were meticulously maintained, often in the same ledgers or storage spaces previously used for colonial legal matters. These documents, sometimes hastily drafted yet carefully preserved, served as tangible evidence of civic engagement and resistance. Meetings were characterized by a measured cadence, motions were made, debates ensued, and decisions were recorded with deliberate care. The familiar spatial hierarchy of the courtroom, with elevated benches for presiding officers and open floor space for participants, helped reinforce orderly deliberation even in times of heightened political tension. In this way, the courthouse became a stage upon which revolutionary ideals were enacted with methodical attention to procedure and propriety. Militia assemblies were another prominent function that courthouses assumed during the Revolutionary era. The county seat often served as the mustering ground for local militias, where officers drilled volunteers, distributed arms and supplies, and coordinated defensive or offensive operations. These assemblies required space, visibility, and accessibility, qualities that the courthouse square naturally provided. Timber fences, modest porches, and open yards around the courthouse accommodated the slow procession of troops, the careful distribution of arms, and the measured observation of drills and formations. Even in these martial contexts, the courthouse's symbolic authority reinforced discipline and order. It was not merely a gathering place, but a tangible reminder that military activity was conducted under the auspices of civic organization and communal responsibility. The Revolutionary period also brought the introduction of new legal codes, reflecting the colony's gradual break from British authority. Courthouses became the loci for the dissemination, discussion, and implementation of these emerging frameworks. Citizens, magistrates, and clerks engaged with statutes, ordinances, and procedural manuals, often adapting English legal traditions to the new realities of self-governance. Courts that had once operated under colonial mandates now functioned under locally determined regulations, a shift that required careful attention to record-keeping, signage, and spatial organization. Courthouses, already familiar as centers of legal authority, provided the infrastructure necessary for this careful transition, ensuring continuity even amid political and social upheaval. In some regions, the courthouse also became a site for public proclamation and civic education. Notices regarding new taxes, militia duties, and revolutionary resolutions were read aloud from steps or balconies, ensuring that information disseminated to both literate and semi-literate populations. Citizens, arriving from farms, villages, and outlying settlements, would listen, take notes, and discuss implications in the courthouse square. The cadence of these gatherings, slow, deliberate, and communal, reinforced the integration of civic participation with legal and military obligations, allowing the courthouse to function simultaneously as a venue for instruction, deliberation, and observation. The symbolic role of the courthouse during the Revolution cannot be overstated. While the building itself remained modest, timber-framed or brick rectangular in form, with a simple pitched roof and functional windows, it stood as a visual and spatial anchor for revolutionary activity. Its familiar presence lent legitimacy to committees, militias, and emerging legal structures, providing continuity amid a rapidly changing political landscape. Citizens could rely on the courthouse as a center of both authority and familiarity, a place where the principles of law and order persisted even as the overarching framework of colonial governance dissolved. Courthouses also facilitated the gradual inculcation of democratic principles. As citizens participated in committees, voted in early elections, or observed deliberations on revolutionary measures, they absorbed the rhythms and procedures of collective governance. The courthouse mediated these experiences, providing a structured space in which debate, record-keeping, and public participation coexisted. In doing so, it subtly trained communities in the practices of accountability, transparency, and civic responsibility that would become foundational to the emerging nation. Even the smallest procedural detail, an officer calling a meeting to order, a clerk recording a resolution, or citizens lining up to submit petitions, contributed to a slow, methodical education in participatory governance. Despite the turbulence of the era, the courthouse often remained a site of relative stability. While townsfolk contended with military incursions, shortages, and political uncertainty, the courthouse square persisted as a spatial and symbolic constant. Its presence communicated resilience and continuity. Law and civic organization endured even amid rebellion, war, and societal transformation. Settlers, soldiers, and officials alike understood that the courthouse was not merely a building but a repository of collective memory, procedure, and authority. Each creaking floorboard, each carefully preserved ledger, and each deliberate assembly reinforced the perception that governance, though challenged, remained operational and comprehensible. The American Revolution also highlighted the duality of the courthouse's role. It was simultaneously a site of continuity and innovation. On the one hand, it maintained familiar procedures, architectural forms, and civic rhythms. On the other, it accommodated new forms of participation, legal experimentation, and military organization. In this balance, the courthouse exemplified the adaptive capacity of civic architecture, modest in form, yet sufficiently flexible to absorb political, social, and military pressures. Through this adaptive function, the courthouse became an enduring symbol of both resilience and transformation, quietly shaping the contours of revolutionary and post-revolutionary governance. In retrospect, the role of courthouses during the American Revolution illustrates the subtle interplay between architecture, civic function, and social transformation. These buildings, modest timber or brick structures, carefully sited and deliberately constructed, were far more than passive containers for legal proceedings. They facilitated revolutionary committees, militia assemblies, public proclamations, and the careful implementation of new legal codes. They anchored communities in times of uncertainty, communicated authority and legitimacy, and provided a slow, persistent framework for the cultivation of democratic practices. In doing so, the courthouse became an enduring witness to the transformation of the American colonies, bridging the delicate transition from colonial governance to a self-determined republic, and laying the foundation for centuries of civic life to follow. In the years following the conclusion of the American Revolution, the fledgling United States entered a period of careful consolidation and deliberate organization. The struggle for independence had demanded extraordinary effort, coordination, and improvisation from both local communities and emerging national institutions. Once the treaties were signed and the cannons fell silent, the focus shifted gradually from revolutionary urgency to the methodical establishment of enduring civic structures. Among the most visible and enduring manifestations of this shift were the county courthouses, which now assumed a central role in formalizing administrative norms, legal continuity, and civic identity. The post-revolutionary era marked a deliberate standardization of courthouse design, location and function, reflecting not only the practical demands of governance, but also the ideals of accessibility, stability and communal pride. Before the revolution, courthouses had grown organically, adapting to settlement patterns, local resources, and immediate needs. Timber and brick structures had sufficed, often modest in scale, irregular in layout, and embedded within the social fabric of their communities. With independence, however, the colony's now sovereign states recognized the necessity of establishing predictable, coherent frameworks for governance. County courts were no longer merely practical instruments of dispute resolution. They were symbols of a new republic, spaces in which law, civic duty and democratic participation could be enacted with clarity and continuity. This recognition prompted a deliberate effort to formalize not only the procedures of governance, but also the very structures that would house it. The post-revolution standardization of courthouses encompassed several interrelated aspects. First, there was a conscious attention to location. While earlier courthouses had been sited primarily for immediate convenience, the new era demanded centrality, accessibility, and symbolic visibility. County seats were now carefully chosen, often at geographic centers within a county or at key intersections of roads, rivers, and emerging trade routes. The goal was to ensure that citizens from all corners of the county could reach the courthouse without undue difficulty, reinforcing the democratic principle that law and administration were meant to be both accessible and impartial. In some cases, the selection of a county seat involved negotiation, surveying, and public input, reflecting the participatory ethos of the post-revolutionary polity. Architectural design also underwent standardization during this period. While materials varied according to regional availability, timber in heavily forested areas, brick in areas with suitable clay deposits, and occasionally stone where local quarries existed, certain design elements became consistently favored. Rectangular or near-square plans, central courtrooms flanked by offices for clerks and record keepers, and elevated platforms for judges were now commonplace. Windows were strategically placed to allow light into the interior while maintaining privacy and security, and roofs were pitched to address regional climatic conditions. Exterior facades, while restrained, often included symbolic touches, modest cupolas or belfries, central entrances with simple pediments, and raised steps that both signaled authority and facilitated public gatherings. The aesthetic choices of this era reflected a dual imperative: functional efficiency and visual communication of civic order, stability, and permanence. The interiors of standardized post-revolution courthouses were similarly deliberate. Courtrooms were spacious enough to accommodate growing populations and public observation, while clerks' offices and record rooms were designed to protect the integrity of documents essential for property rights, taxation, and legal proceedings. Wooden benches and tables, carefully arranged, allowed citizens to witness and participate in judicial and administrative processes without infringing upon procedural formality. Lighting, whether through windows or later through oil lamps and candles, was intended to be adequate for reading and recording without distracting from the solemnity of proceedings. Each interior decision, subtle as it may have seemed, reinforced the broader objectives of clarity, accessibility, and structured governance. Post-revolution standardization extended beyond the physical form of courthouses to encompass procedural norms and civic function. County courts were now expected to adhere to codified legal frameworks derived from state constitutions and statutory law, a shift from the more ad hoc approaches of the colonial period. The courthouse in turn became a predictable venue for the administration of justice, the recording of property transactions, the collection of taxes and the orchestration of elections. These formalized routines, coupled with the familiar and consistent spatial design of the courthouse itself, reinforced the public perception of authority and legitimacy, providing citizens with confidence in both the stability and the fairness of local governance. The courthouse square or grounds were also standardized as extensions of the building's function. Open areas facilitated public gatherings, market days, militia musterings, and town meetings, echoing the dual social and legal roles established in earlier colonial practice. Courthouse steps, porches, and surrounding spaces were deliberately maintained to accommodate crowds, announcements, and the slow, methodical processes of civic life. In effect, the standardized courthouse became not just a building but a locus around which communities could gather, observe, and participate in governance. The spatial clarity reinforced the orderly conduct of social and civic interaction, embedding law and administration into the lived experience of townspeople. In addition to functionality, post-revolutionary courthouses carried symbolic weight. They were, in subtle yet deliberate ways, monuments to the ideals of the new nation. Their measured architecture conveyed stability in a period when the young republic faced the challenge of forging legitimacy, both internally and externally. The deliberate siting, restrained ornamentation, and clear spatial hierarchy communicated that governance was not capricious but rational, accessible, and continuous. Citizens approaching the courthouse were met with a visual and tactile reminder of the new social contract, one grounded in law, order, and collective responsibility. The process of standardization was also educational, inculcating citizens in the procedures and rhythms of democratic participation. Courthouses served as venues for elections, public announcements, civic deliberation, and legal instruction. The familiarity and predictability of the courthouse's form and function allowed communities to internalize the principles of governance slowly and steadily, ensuring that civic knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. In this sense, the architecture itself acted as a teacher, mediating experience, expectation, and civic understanding through its spatial and procedural design. By the early 19th century, the effects of post-revolution standardization were evident across the young nation. Courthouses shared a recognizable form and function, whether located in the rolling hills of Virginia, the river valleys of Pennsylvania, or the emerging towns of New England. Their physical presence, procedural consistency, and social centrality created a network of civic infrastructure that anchored counties, facilitated governance, and embodied the enduring principles of the Republic. In both subtle and explicit ways, these buildings communicated the stability, legitimacy, and accessibility of the new American political order. In sum, the post-revolutionary period represents a turning point in the history of county courthouses, a transition from improvisational, locally determined structures to standardized, deliberate, and symbolically charged spaces. Courthouses were no longer merely practical tools, they were carefully calibrated instruments of governance, pedagogy, and civic identity. Their architecture, location, and procedural routines reflected the ideals of accessibility, stability, and communal pride, embedding the slow, deliberate rhythms of law, administration, and public participation into the daily life of the nation. Through this standardization, the courthouse became both a tangible anchor in the physical landscape and a symbolic anchor in the moral and civic imagination of early America. As the new century dawned, the young United States entered a period of cautious growth and emerging confidence. The population of counties across the nation was increasing steadily, fueled by natural population growth, continued westward expansion, and the gradual densification of towns and settlements. Within this evolving social and geographic landscape, the county courthouse underwent a subtle yet profound transformation. No longer solely a modest timber or brick structure, the early 19th century courthouse reflected both the practical needs of an expanding populace and the symbolic aspiration to convey permanence, authority, and civic pride. These buildings began to adopt more deliberate architectural flourishes, borrowing classical motifs from European models while retaining a restrained functional dignity, suitable for the slower rhythms of community life. The early 1800s were marked by experimentation with form and ornamentation, as counties sought to construct buildings that communicated stability and authority in both visual and spatial terms. Brickwork became increasingly elaborate, moving beyond the functional and utilitarian to embrace decorative patterns, recessed panels, and carefully proportioned facades. Mortar lines were executed with precision, corners squared and reinforced, and bricks occasionally arranged to create subtle textures or symbolic motifs. Stone foundations were emphasized, lending both structural integrity and visual weight, a grounding effect that reinforced the perception of permanence. In some regions, courthouses incorporated local stone, quarried and transported with painstaking effort, each block serving as a tangible expression of civic investment and communal labor. Cupolas, small towers rising above the roofline, became characteristic features of many early 19th century courthouses. These elements served practical purposes: ventilation, natural light, and occasionally housing a bell to signal court sessions, but their symbolic value was equally significant. A cupolas could be seen from a distance, establishing the courthouse as a visual anchor within the town and a marker of civic authority across the surrounding landscape. The rhythmic rise of the cupolas, whether octagonal, square or circular, subtly communicated that law and governance had a steady elevated presence, overseeing the slow unfolding of community life from a measured serene height. Classical European elements, borrowed from Georgian, Federal and later Greek Revival styles, became increasingly integrated into courthouse design. Pediments, pilasters, columns, and symmetrical facades communicated order, stability, and rationality. These architectural motifs were more than mere ornamentation. They were intentional symbols of the ideals of governance inherited, in part from European traditions, reinterpreted within the American context. A modest portico, or pedimented entry, subtly instructed citizens that the proceedings within were serious, deliberate, and rooted in enduring principles. Yet, despite the borrowed elements, these courthouses remained adapted to local needs and materials. The scale was restrained, ornamentation modest, and interiors designed primarily for functional clarity rather than lavish display. Interior spaces also evolved during this period. Courtrooms were larger, reflecting the need to accommodate growing populations and the increasing complexity of legal proceedings. Elevated benches for judges, clerks' tables, and galleries for public observation were carefully arranged to maintain clarity and order. Windows, tall and evenly spaced, allowed natural light to fill the interior, emphasizing both transparency and solemnity. Floors were often pine or oak planks, polished over time by the slow rhythm of footsteps, and walls were occasionally painted or paneled to communicate a sense of permanence and dignity. Every detail, from the spacing of benches to the height of ceilings, was carefully considered to balance function, symbolism, and the comfort of participants and observers alike. The location and siting of courthouses continued to be deliberate. While geographic centrality remained important, early 19th century planners increasingly considered the visual prominence of the building within the townscape. Courthouses were often positioned on gentle rises, at the intersection of major roads, or within a central square, ensuring visibility from multiple approaches. The surrounding grounds were typically open, allowing for gatherings, public announcements, elections and militia musters, echoing the multifaceted social role of the courthouse established in previous centuries. The careful siting and landscaping reinforced the courthouse's function as both a literal and symbolic heart of the county, a slow, constant presence anchoring civic life in space as well as in social consciousness. These early 19th century courthouses also reflected technological and material developments of the period. Improved brick kilns, sawmills and carpentry tools allowed for more precise construction, while evolving transportation networks facilitated the movement of stone, iron hardware, and other durable materials. Craftsmen applied increasingly sophisticated techniques to create durable, resilient, and aesthetically coherent structures, each project requiring months or even years of careful planning and labor. The resulting buildings embodied both the community's practical investment in civic infrastructure and its symbolic commitment to law, order, and continuity. The courthouse also continued its social and civic functions, which remained as central to its identity as its physical form. Court days were measured affairs, with litigants, jurors and observers arriving from surrounding farms and villages. Elections were held under the watchful gaze of the building, public proclamations read from steps or porches, and markets or fairs sometimes clustered nearby, reinforcing the courthouse's role as a focal point of community life. Even the quieter, routine moments, the clerk's careful writing in ledgers, the magistrate reviewing case files, or townsfolk traversing the square, contributed to a slow, meditative rhythm of civic participation and observation. Importantly, the evolution of courthouse architecture in this era also reflected the symbolic ambition of a nation defining itself. The modest classical elements, the solid masonry, and the elevated cupolas all conveyed stability, legitimacy, and the authority of the law, while remaining accessible and familiar to the population. Citizens approaching the courthouse were greeted with a sense of order and predictability. The building communicated that governance, though complex, was structured, visible, and enduring. In these subtle ways, the courthouse became a teaching tool, reinforcing through its presence, layout, and materials the values of civic responsibility, legal clarity, and communal identity. By the mid-19th century, the courthouse had evolved from a purely functional building into a symbol of both continuity and aspiration. Its architecture reflected not only the practical needs of an expanding population, but also the ideals of a community asserting permanence, authority, and civic pride amid a dynamic social landscape. The combination of brickwork, cupolas, classical motifs, and carefully considered interior and exterior spaces established a recognizable and enduring typology for county courthouses, one that would continue to influence American civic architecture for generations. In sum, the early 19th century courthouse represents a period of deliberate refinement and symbolic amplification. Its evolution was slow, methodical, and deeply integrated with the rhythms of community life, reflecting both practical requirements and civic aspirations. Through careful seating, durable materials, and restrained classical ornamentation, these buildings communicated authority, permanence, and accessibility. They anchored growing towns and counties, structured legal and civic processes, and quietly reinforced the principles of governance, participation, and communal identity that would shape the American civic landscape for decades to come. As the 19th century progressed, a subtle yet profound evolution in town planning began to emerge across many regions of the United States, particularly in the South and Midwest. Beyond their function as centers of law and administration, courthouses increasingly defined the physical and social fabric of towns, rising as the focal point of deliberate, measured urban design. This phenomenon, the Courthouse Square, was neither accidental nor hasty. It was the product of careful observation, planning, and the slow, deliberate integration of civic, commercial, and residential life. In its deliberate arrangement, the Courthouse Square created an enduring rhythm, both social and visual, one that structured the daily experience of townsfolk and silently communicated the values of stability, accessibility, and communal identity. The Courthouse Square was typically conceived with meticulous attention to spatial hierarchy and centrality. At its core sat the courthouse itself, elevated slightly above the surrounding terrain, often on a gentle rise or plateau. This positioning was intentional, designed to make the building visible from multiple approaches, to assert its symbolic authority, and to establish a central reference point around which other structures could be oriented. Surrounding the courthouse were open areas, sometimes grassed, sometimes simply compacted earth, that allowed townsfolk to gather, whether for court sessions, elections, market days, or public proclamations. These spaces created a measured breathing room, a deliberate buffer that reinforced both the prominence of the courthouse and the orderly conduct of civic life. Around the central open space, streets were often laid out in a grid or radial pattern, leading toward and away from the courthouse square. Shops, taverns, inns, and service buildings clustered along these streets, benefiting from the foot traffic and visibility that the courthouse generated. The deliberate positioning of commercial structures around the square was not merely practical, it created a slow, orchestrated flow of activity, in which civic, economic, and social life intersected with quiet regularity. Citizens moving through the square encountered the courthouse as the inevitable visual and spatial anchor, a constant reminder that law, governance, and communal responsibility were central to everyday existence. Residential structures, while often set slightly further back from the immediate perimeter of the square, were likewise oriented to maintain a coherent visual rhythm. Houses were typically modest, reflecting regional materials and construction methods, but their alignment and spacing reinforced the sense of order imparted by the courthouse and its immediate surroundings. Each street, lot, and building contributed to a slow, methodical layering of civic and social space, establishing a rhythm that governed not only sightlines and traffic, but also the experience of daily life. The Courthouse Square, in this way, became a deliberate choreography of architecture and landscape, integrating multiple facets of community experience into a cohesive whole. Within the square itself, additional design elements reinforced the building's centrality and the town's social rhythms. Steps, low retaining walls, benches, and occasionally planted trees provided spaces for observation, conversation, and preparation before entering the courthouse. These subtle architectural and landscape interventions mediated the transition from ordinary daily life to the formal civic activities that the courthouse contained. Citizens approaching the courthouse were guided through a slow, deliberate spatial experience, moving from streets and homes into the open square, pausing to observe, gather, and reflect before ascending the steps or entering the courtroom. In this progression, the architecture of the square taught, reinforced, and regulated social conduct as quietly as any legal code. The courthouse square also served as the locus for seasonal, economic, and social rhythms. Market days, fairs, and public celebrations were frequently held in the square, integrating commerce and festivity with civic observation. Farmers, artisans, and itinerant merchants would establish temporary stalls or tables, arranging their goods in orderly lines that echoed the geometries of the surrounding streets and plots. Citizens moving among these vendors did so under the constant visual presence of the courthouse, a reminder that even economic and social activity was framed within the context of civic order and communal oversight. Militia drills, public readings of announcements, and election gatherings similarly utilized the square's open space, reinforcing its multifunctional character and central importance to the rhythm of daily life. The visual rhythm of courthouse squares extended beyond functional considerations to symbolic and aesthetic effects. The repetition of building lines, the measured spacing of streets, and the elevation of the courthouse itself created a slow, contemplative visual cadence. From a distance, the courthouse tower, cupola, or pediment served as a focal point, guiding the eye and providing orientation. This careful orchestration of visual hierarchy not only reinforced the building's symbolic authority, but also lent towns a sense of permanence, dignity, and order. In regions where settlements were still nascent or where rapid population growth threatened chaos, the courthouse square imposed a deliberate, measured logic upon the landscape, a slow and enduring testament to civic design. The courtyard and surrounding grounds were likewise spaces for informal social interaction. Citizens paused on steps or benches, conversed while waiting for proceedings to begin, or lingered after court sessions to exchange news, gossip, or practical information. The square thus facilitated a subtle layering of civic, social, and economic life, allowing communities to cohere through repeated, predictable patterns of interaction. This continuity, though often overlooked in favor of grander historical narratives, was essential to the slow cultivation of civic identity, trust, and shared norms. In every step across the square, every measured glance toward the courthouse facade, and every pause beneath a tree or on a bench, townsfolk absorbed lessons in order, hierarchy, and communal engagement. Regional variation also enriched the courthouse square phenomenon. In the south, squares were often larger, reflecting agricultural abundance and the spatial separation of plantations and town centers. In the Midwest, smaller, more compact squares facilitated integration with emerging grid-based towns and denser settlement patterns. Despite these differences, the underlying principles remained consistent: centrality, visibility, accessibility, and multifunctionality. The courthouse square, whether expansive or compact, provided a slow, deliberate framework for the interaction of law, commerce, and social life, embedding the courthouse's authority into the very pattern of urban and civic experience. Over time, courthouse squares became enduring markers of community identity. They anchored towns visually, socially, and symbolically, providing continuity amid demographic shifts, economic fluctuations, and occasional political upheaval. Even as building materials and architectural styles evolved, the square persisted as a slow, deliberate framework for communal organization. Each generation of citizens approached the square with an intuitive understanding of its function, a space of order, gathering, observation, and civic participation, orchestrated around the steady presence of the courthouse at its center. In essence, the courthouse square phenomenon illustrates the profound interplay between architecture, urban planning, and civic life. These spaces were neither accidental nor purely functional. They were deliberate, methodical constructions that structured visual perception, social behavior, and communal engagement. The courthouse, elevated and central, provided authority and continuity, while the surrounding streets, shops, homes, and open spaces facilitated the rhythms of daily life, seasonal activity, and civic participation. Together they created a slow, measured urban choreography, in which every citizen, pedestrian, and visitor participated, consciously or not, in the ongoing life of the county and town. The story of county courthouses in early America is not solely a narrative of law, governance, or civic identity. It is equally a story of labor, craftsmanship, and the delicate interplay between local resources and communal aspiration. Each courthouse, whether modestly timbered or elaborately brick-faced, was the product of countless hours of human effort, shaped by the hands of carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, and laborers, whose work was measured not only in functionality, but in symbolic expression. In the careful selection of materials, the application of artisanal skill, and the slow orchestration of construction, these buildings silently narrated the economy, character, and identity of the communities that erected them. The choice of materials was among the most deliberate decisions in courthouse construction. Timber, often sourced from nearby forests, was a staple in the earliest frontier and early 19th century buildings. Settlers felled oaks, pines, and maples, hewing beams and planks with axes, adzes, and saws. Each cut, measured and executed with painstaking precision, reflected both practicality and an intimate familiarity with the natural environment. Timber was not merely a structural element, it was a medium through which the landscape was transmuted into civic purpose. In regions with access to clay, brick became the preferred material for its durability and permanence. Local kilns were established to fire bricks, a labor-intensive process requiring control of temperature, fuel, and moisture, and producing units that could withstand both the passage of time and the seasonal fluctuations of climate. Stone, when available, was quarried, shaped, and lifted into position with rudimentary pulleys and levers, its weight lending an almost tactile authority to the courthouse, grounding it in both earth and human labor. The labor invested in courthouse construction extended far beyond raw materials. Skilled craftsmen applied techniques honed over decades, if not centuries, often blending European methods with local adaptations. Carpenters framed walls and floors, joined beams with mortise and tenon techniques, and carefully planned and finished surfaces. Masons laid brick and stone with meticulous attention to alignment, mortar consistency, and visual effect, sometimes creating decorative patterns or subtle reliefs that imbued the building with understated artistry. Blacksmiths forged hinges, locks, nails, and hardware essential to both functionality and security, their work reflecting a combination of strength, durability, and aesthetic consideration. Every nail, joint, and layer of mortar was placed with deliberate care, a slow choreography of skill and effort that mirrored the deliberate rhythms of civic life the building was intended to host. The construction of a courthouse was rarely the endeavor of a single individual or even a small group. It was a communal enterprise that subtly shaped local economies. Laborers were employed over months or even years, their wages supporting families and circulating within the county. Timber cutting and brick firing supported ancillary industries. Sawmills, kilns, and quarries expanded to meet the demands of the project. Local blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons often trained apprentices, transmitting skills while ensuring continuity of craft traditions. In many ways, the courthouse project functioned as an economic catalyst, linking settlement, production, and employment into a coherent, slow-moving system that reinforced communal interdependence. The scale of investment, both material and temporal, imbued courthouses with symbolic weight. Communities recognized that a courthouse was not merely a utilitarian shelter for legal proceedings. It was a tangible testament to collective effort, resource management, and shared ambition. Citizens watching the building rise, whether from neighboring homes or from across fields, absorbed subtle lessons in patience, coordination, and civic pride. The rising walls, carefully mortared bricks, polished wooden surfaces, and symmetrical facades became a visible narrative of human diligence and collective aspiration, silently asserting that law, order, and community were matters worthy of time, labor, and material investment. Even the sourcing of materials reinforced local identity. Timber reflected the surrounding forests, brick the regional clay, and stone the local geology. The courthouse in its very composition was an embodied reflection of place. The materials spoke of the land from which they were drawn, and the hands that transformed them. In this sense, the building was simultaneously a functional edifice and a slow, deliberate expression of environmental and social context, a testament to the interplay between human settlement and natural endowment. Residents could read the landscape of the courthouse in its materials, understanding both the environment they inhabited and the communal effort required to inhabit it deliberately and responsibly. The slow pace of construction also contributed to the courthouse's character. Unlike contemporary industrialized buildings, these structures were not mass-produced or assembled hastily. They were the product of patience, sequencing, and attentiveness. The foundations were dug by hand, timber squared and joined, brick kilns tended over weeks, and stone carefully lifted into place. Each stage required coordination, supervision, and careful observation, with errors corrected immediately to maintain structural integrity. The deliberate cadence of construction mirrored the deliberate cadence of governance. The building was designed to house, measured, methodical, and anchored in continuity. The very process of creating the courthouse became a slow ritual, embedding social, economic, and symbolic rhythms into the labor of hands and the minds of planners and builders alike. Craftsmanship extended beyond mere construction to the subtleties of interior detail. Wood paneling, benches, desks, and clerks' tables were fashioned to serve both function and aesthetic coherence, while doors and window frames were carefully fitted to maintain both security and visual clarity. In some regions, artisans carved decorative elements, subtly integrating local motifs, flora, or civic symbols into door frames, mantelpieces, or staircases. Even paint, applied in restrained tones, contributed to a coherent interior atmosphere, ensuring that the courthouse's internal space reflected the dignity and order conveyed by its exterior. The building in every aspect communicated civic seriousness, endurance, and the care with which the community regarded the administration of justice and governance. Finally, the construction of the courthouse subtly reinforced social hierarchies and relationships within the community. Skilled artisans received recognition for their expertise, laborers were valued for their reliability and endurance, and communal participation in provisioning, transport, or observation fostered interdependence. The courthouse became a site where social bonds were enacted, observed, and reinforced, not through spectacle but through the slow, patient rhythms of collaborative labor. Each board raised, each brick laid, each joinery completed was a quiet testament to the interplay between social cohesion, civic pride, and material expression. In essence, the materials, craftsmanship, and local economy that underpinned courthouse construction reflect a profoundly human story. These buildings were more than legal structures. They were the product of deliberate, methodical engagement with land, labor, and skill. They absorbed and reflected the rhythms of settlement, the circulation of economic life, and the character of communities committed to law, order, and civic identity. Through their materiality, artisanship, and slow emergence from local landscapes, courthouses became enduring symbols of collective effort, embedding civic values into the very fabric of timber, brick, and stone. As the 19th century progressed, county courthouses increasingly became repositories not only of civic pride and architectural refinement, but of legal complexity, procedural rigor, and the subtle mechanisms of societal order. The expansion of populations, the diversification of economic activity, and the increasing sophistication of property, contract, and criminal law necessitated a corresponding evolution in the functions of these buildings. Courthouses, once modest and relatively simple structures, primarily concerned with adjudicating local disputes, now accommodated a growing bureaucratic apparatus, integrating clerical work, judicial procedure, and civic oversight in a manner that was at once methodical, deliberate, and quietly transformative. At the core of this evolution was the slow, painstaking expansion of record-keeping, property deeds, court rulings, marriage licenses, tax rolls, and business transactions, all essential for the orderly functioning of a growing county. were meticulously documented and stored within the courthouse. Wooden cabinets, pigeonholes and secured vaults were carefully arranged to facilitate access while ensuring the preservation of these vital records. Clerks, often trained over years, developed a steady, almost meditative rhythm, recording events in flowing script, cross-referencing cases, and maintaining indexes that allowed legal continuity across decades. The act of record-keeping, though quiet and repetitive, underpinned the legitimacy of law, property and social relations, allowing a dispersed populace to navigate complex interactions with predictability and trust. The legal framework within which courthouses operated also underwent gradual but profound transformation. Early in the 19th century, counties were still largely governed by simplified codes derived from colonial practice and English common law. Over time, however, states began codifying civil, criminal, and procedural law, producing comprehensive statutes that courts were obliged to interpret, enforce, and record. Courthouses thus became sites of continuous engagement with legal texts, requiring clerks, judges, and attorneys to navigate evolving codes with precision and deliberation. Each hearing, judgment, or filing was embedded within a broader, carefully maintained legal architecture, reflecting both local custom and state-mandated norms. The courthouse, in this context, served as a physical manifestation of legal continuity, a quiet anchor in the often slow and meticulous administration of justice. Civil cases, particularly those concerning property, contracts, and inheritance, grew increasingly complex during this period. Farmers, merchants, and industrialists all relied upon the clarity and predictability of legal procedures to safeguard their interests. Courthouses became spaces where disputes were resolved through careful examination of documents, testimonies, and precedent. Judges presided from elevated benches, clerks recorded proceedings with methodical attention, and juries deliberated according to codified rules. The interior spaces of the courthouse were designed to accommodate this slow, contemplative work. Courtrooms allowed room for observation and orderly participation, while adjacent offices provided clerks and officials with the workspace necessary to maintain the continuity of administrative processes. The rhythm of daily activity within the courthouse mirrored the broader rhythm of community life, deliberate, procedural, and quietly ordered. Criminal law likewise evolved in complexity. Courthouses served as venues for the adjudication of offenses ranging from minor infractions to serious felonies, requiring the careful orchestration of witnesses, defendants, legal counsel, and local enforcement. Even in remote or sparsely populated counties, the courthouse was equipped to manage these proceedings with a slow, methodical precision that reinforced the perception of authority and fairness. The architecture itself facilitated this: well-defined entryways, segregated spaces for participants, and elevated judicial benches created a spatial logic that reinforced procedural clarity. Each trial, while dramatic in content, unfolded within a framework that emphasized continuity, restraint, and orderly process, contributing to the broader stability of social life. Administrative duties expanded alongside judicial responsibilities. Courthouses became centers for voter registration, tax collection, infrastructure planning, and civic announcements. Officials and clerks managed a growing body of documentation, ensuring that every transaction, record, and civic action was carefully preserved. The building itself accommodated these functions through a combination of open interior halls, partitioned offices, and secure storage spaces. Furniture, shelving, and filing systems were carefully designed to support both efficiency and longevity, allowing bureaucratic processes to proceed with a deliberate, measured rhythm. In this way, the courthouse embodied both the visible authority of law and the quiet persistence of administrative labor that sustained it. One of the subtler dimensions of courthouse evolution was the cultivation of public perception and trust. Citizens entering the building, observing proceedings, or consulting records internalized lessons in order, procedure, and the predictability of governance. The courthouse, through its architecture, layout, and procedural rhythm, communicated that the county's legal and administrative functions were consistent, impartial, and enduring. This slow absorption of civic norms contributed to social cohesion, reinforcing the legitimacy of local institutions even as the population grew and diversified. The courthouse thus functions simultaneously as a physical structure, a locus of governance, and a mediator of communal values. Regional variations in courthouse function and design reflected both local economic conditions and social expectations. In some Midwestern towns, courthouses were deliberately designed to accommodate both the slow pace of rural life and the administrative needs of an increasingly interconnected population. In southern counties, larger courthouses with expansive galleries and open squares facilitated both formal legal proceedings and public gatherings, blending legal, social, and civic functions in a rhythm attuned to local climate and social structure. Across regions, however, the unifying principle remained the same. The courthouse mediated the deliberate, methodical processes through which law and governance operated, providing continuity amid demographic and economic change. By the mid to late 19th century, the evolution of courthouses reflected broader societal trends. Increased literacy, expanding commercial activity, and the slow professionalization of legal and administrative roles all placed new demands on these buildings. Courthouses were equipped to handle the cumulative weight of decades of documentation, procedural complexity, and civic expectation. Even as the pace of community life quickened in some areas, the courthouse remained a measured, deliberate space where legal and administrative rhythms were maintained with quiet consistency. It was a space in which the minutiae of governance, the precise recording of deeds, the orderly presentation of cases, the careful interpretation of statutes sustained the broader stability of society. In essence, the courthouse's evolution in the 19th century illustrates the quiet power of deliberate, persistent administrative work. Beyond trials, elections, and announcements, these buildings housed the slow, methodical processes that ensured continuity, fairness, and social cohesion. Their architecture, interior design, and procedural protocols collectively reinforced the authority of law while embedding it in the rhythms of daily life. Citizens moving through the courthouse, observing proceedings or consulting records participated, often unknowingly, in a slow and enduring system of civic education and social stability. The story of legal evolution within courthouses is thus one of cumulative care, patient attention, and methodical practice. It demonstrates that governance is sustained not only by grand gestures or dramatic events, but by the quiet, measured labor of clerks, judges, and citizens interacting within spaces designed to support continuity, clarity, and order. The courthouse, in its enduring presence, serves as a testament to this slow and deliberate cultivation of societal order, a structure whose significance extends far beyond its walls into the lived rhythms of the community it serves. The mid-19th century in the United States was a period marked by turbulence, uncertainty, and transformation, as the nation convulsed under the weight of sectional conflict and civil war. County courthouses, which had long stood as measured embodiments of civic authority, legal order, and community identity, were inevitably drawn into the currents of this upheaval. These buildings, timeless in their architecture, yet vulnerable in their materiality, witnessed disruption, occupation, and in some instances, destruction, their slow, deliberate rhythms of civic life temporarily suspended or irrevocably altered. Yet, amid the chaos, a subtle and remarkable resilience emerged, one that would allow communities to slowly, patiently restore order, rebuild civic trust, and reaffirm the continuity of governance. The onset of the Civil War introduced a wide spectrum of challenges for courthouses across both Union and Confederate territories. In regions directly impacted by military campaigns, courthouses became sites of occupation, often commandeered by armies for logistical purposes, administrative offices, or temporary barracks. Soldiers, officials, and laborers moved through the familiar spaces of courtrooms, clerk offices, and public squares, adapting them to the pressing demands of wartime. Steps that had long served for public announcements, gatherings, and market activity were transformed into points of assembly for troop movements. The measured cadence of daily civic life replaced by the abrupt rhythms of military necessity. Citizens, once accustomed to the slow, deliberate unfolding of court sessions and civic rituals, witnessed their courthouse transformed into a stage for the extraordinary, the urgent, and the provisional. Destruction was another persistent threat during this era. Courthouses, often constructed of timber, brick, and locally quarried stone, were vulnerable to fire, artillery, and other wartime hazards. In both strategic and opportunistic contexts, buildings were burned, partially dismantled, or otherwise damaged, leaving gaps not only in physical infrastructure, but in the continuity of civic function. When a courthouse fell, the effects rippled through the county, court records were lost, elections disrupted, property disputes delayed, and the symbolic anchor of civic life temporarily removed. The loss was measured, cumulative, and deeply felt, yet communities demonstrated a quiet persistence, slowly organizing temporary venues for court sessions, record-keeping, and civic assemblies, often in churches, taverns, or private homes. This improvisational adaptation reflected both necessity and an enduring commitment to the principles of local governance. Amid the broader devastation of war, the courthouse remained a focal point for the slow preservation of civil processes. Even in occupied or contested areas, local officials endeavored to maintain records, conduct trials, and oversee administrative functions whenever circumstances allowed. Clerks and judges labored under immense constraints, reconstructing documentation, safeguarding property records, and ensuring that legal continuity was maintained to the greatest extent possible. These acts were neither publicized nor celebrated. They were quiet, methodical, and essential, representing a subtle but powerful form of civic resilience. In their patient attention to the minutiae of law and administration, these officials ensured that governance could resume more fully once military pressures subsided. The Courthouse Square, too, reflected the complex interplay of disruption and adaptation. Open spaces, once sites of civic gathering, militia drilling, and market activity, were repurposed for military encampments, temporary storage, or public observation of troop movements. Trees, benches, and walkways were sometimes removed or damaged to accommodate wartime logistics, yet over time, these spaces were gradually restored, often incorporating improvements or adjustments made during the occupation. In this way, the Courthouse Square itself became a living record of adaptation, reflecting both the temporary intrusion of extraordinary circumstances and the persistent rhythm of communal life that reasserted itself slowly, deliberately, and with measured continuity. Reconstruction following the Civil War was an equally deliberate process. Communities, often weakened economically and socially, undertook the careful repair or rebuilding of courthouses, prioritizing both function and symbolic presence. Timber frames were reinforced, brick facades restored, cupolas replaced or repaired, and interiors refitted for the orderly conduct of legal and administrative duties. Skilled laborers, many of whom had honed their craft over decades, were employed once again, their work measured and methodical. The restoration process, unlike wartime occupation, emphasized permanence, stability, and the reaffirmation of civic identity. Courthouses that rose from the ashes or were repaired became emblematic of continuity, resilience, and the deliberate reconstruction of social and legal order. The symbolic weight of restored courthouses was profound. Citizens returning to familiar squares and facades absorbed reassurance from the slow, deliberate re-establishment of routine. Court sessions resumed according to prior schedules, property records were meticulously maintained or reconstructed, and civic meetings gradually reclaimed their place within the square. The building's architecture, materials, and carefully maintained interiors communicated that governance, law, and community life persisted. Despite the extraordinary disruptions of war, the courthouse, in its quiet endurance, served as both a practical and symbolic anchor, signaling to all observers that civic structures, physical, procedural, and social, could withstand even the extraordinary pressures of armed conflict. Beyond the immediate post-war period, courthouses also became spaces in which the community's evolving identity was reflected and reaffirmed. Alteration often included modest architectural enhancements, updates to interior spaces, and the careful integration of records recovered or reconstructed during the war years. These improvements were not ostentatious, they were deliberate and restrained, emphasizing functionality, durability, and continuity. The act of restoring a courthouse was itself a slow, contemplative reaffirmation of shared values. Law, order, and civic participation were once again central to daily life, quietly reasserted through the careful work of craftsmen, officials, and citizens alike. In essence, The Civil War era highlights both the vulnerability and the resilience of courthouses as physical and social structures. These buildings were subject to occupation, repurposing, and destruction, yet they also became sites of quiet persistence, improvisation, and methodical reconstruction. Their slow restoration, through measured architectural repair, careful record-keeping, and the re-establishment of civic routines, embodied a deliberate reaffirmation of governance, legality, and communal continuity. The courthouse's endurance was not merely symbolic, it was functional, mediating the return of civic order, fostering trust and quietly instructing citizens in the rhythm of law, administration and social responsibility. The story of courthouses during this period is, therefore, a narrative of continuity amid disruption, of slow recovery amid destruction, and of subtle resilience amid historical turbulence. Through the deliberate labor of rebuilding, the careful preservation of records, and the measured resumption of civic functions, communities reasserted the quiet authority of local governance. The courthouse, weathered but standing, communicated a steadfast message that even in times of extraordinary upheaval, the deliberate rhythms of law, order, and communal life could endure, patiently reasserted through human diligence, careful craftsmanship, and the enduring logic of civic structure. In the years following the cessation of hostilities, the nation faced the slow, deliberate work of reconstruction, not merely of infrastructure or economy, but of civic life itself. County courthouses, many of which had been damaged, destroyed, or repurposed during the turmoil of the Civil War, became central to this painstaking process. Their reconstruction was not hurried, it was methodical, deliberate, and imbued with symbolic weight. Every decision regarding materials, design, placement, and internal arrangement reflected a community's intent to reassert authority, restore public trust, and communicate the continuity and stability of local government. In essence, the rebuilding of courthouses after the war was both a practical necessity and a carefully orchestrated act of civic reaffirmation. Reconstruction often began with the assessment of structural damage. Timber frames weakened by fire, brick walls cracked or partially demolished, roofs compromised, and interior woodwork lost to occupation or neglect required careful evaluation. Local officials, sometimes in consultation with architects or master builders, determined which elements could be salvaged, which required reinforcement, and which demanded complete replacement. This process was deliberate, reflective, and infused with caution. The aim was not merely to create a functional space, but to construct a building that could endure decades of civic use, withstand environmental and human stresses, and convey the renewed permanence of local governance. Material choice played a particularly significant role during reconstruction. Communities often opted for more durable materials than those used in pre-war buildings, favoring brick or stone over timber, where feasible. This choice reflected both the lessons learned from wartime vulnerability and the aspiration to convey permanence and resilience. Bricks were carefully fired in local kilns or imported from regional sources, while stone was selected for its density, texture, and ability to weather both time and climate. Timber, when used, was treated with attention to durability and stability, ensuring that wooden floors, beams, and paneling would endure decades of careful use. The very act of selecting, preparing, and assembling these materials was a slow, meditative process, emphasizing longevity, care, and civic intention. Architectural ambition increased during this period as well. Reconstruction presented communities with an opportunity to expand or enhance the courthouse, often incorporating design elements that communicated civic pride, authority, and renewed optimism. Cupolas rose higher, pediments became more pronounced, and classical elements, columns, pilasters, and symmetrical facades were integrated with greater deliberation and skill. Interior spaces were enlarged to accommodate growing populations and the increasing complexity of legal and administrative functions. Courtrooms were made more spacious, offices for clerks and officials expanded, and storage facilities for records carefully organized to ensure both accessibility and security. Every element, from exterior ornamentation to interior spatial planning, was imbued with the intent to signify continuity, authority, and civic resilience. The reconstruction process was also a slow affirmation of local labor, craftsmanship, and community engagement. Carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, and laborers were engaged over months or even years, their work measured and deliberate. Apprentices learned from skilled artisans, observing techniques and absorbing the subtle interplay of precision, patience, and aesthetic judgment that informed every aspect of construction. The process itself became a reflection of civic values, diligence, persistence, and collective effort. Citizens observing the courthouse rise from the ruins or from a temporary foundation were witness to a tangible reaffirmation of communal identity, authority, and shared purpose. Every brick laid, every beam joined, and every decorative flourish contributed not only to the building's functionality, but also to the slow, deliberate reassertion of law and governance. Reconstruction also afforded an opportunity for deliberate urban planning and visual reinforcement of civic centrality. Courthouses were frequently positioned on prominent terrain, such as slight rises or central squares, enhancing their visibility and symbolic presence. Surrounding spaces were carefully planned to facilitate civic gatherings, markets, public announcements, and militia musters, maintaining the Courthouse Square as the visual and social anchor of town life. Streets radiated in measured patterns, shops and residences were aligned thoughtfully, and trees, benches, and pathways were arranged to guide both pedestrian movement and the perception of order. In this spatial choreography, the courthouse was the fulcrum, drawing the eye, shaping movement, and silently instructing citizens in the deliberate rhythms of civic participation. The symbolic dimension of reconstructed courthouses cannot be overstated. These buildings were not only functional spaces for legal proceedings and record-keeping, they were monuments to communal resilience, patience, and civic continuity. Their deliberate form, scale, and embellishments communicated that despite the violence and disruption of war, the structures and institutions of governance endured. Citizens approaching the building were reassured by its solidity, symmetry, and permanence, internalizing a sense of stability and authority that extended beyond the physical walls. In this way, the courthouse functioned as both a practical instrument of law and a slowly articulated narrative of civic recovery and reassurance. Interior spaces were carefully considered to support evolving legal and administrative demands. Clerks' offices, storage vaults, and record rooms were organized to accommodate the increasing complexity of property, tax, and civil records, reflecting both wartime losses and the anticipated growth of local bureaucracies. Courtrooms were arranged to allow clear observation by the public, maintain order during proceedings, and facilitate the measured adjudication of disputes. Furniture, finishes, and lighting were chosen with attention to both function and symbolism, reinforcing the dignity of legal processes and the deliberate rhythm of civic activity. Every detail, however small, reflected a careful orchestration intended to restore confidence, ensure continuity, and communicate the authority of law. Reconstruction also mirrored broader social and political aspirations. Courthouses were reconstructed not only to serve the practical needs of the immediate population, but also to embody the ideals of post-war civic identity, resilience, continuity, and the deliberate restoration of lawful order. The patient labor, careful planning, and thoughtful design all contributed to a quiet pedagogy, teaching citizens, through observation, participation, and the slow rhythms of daily interaction, that governance, law, and civic life could endure, even in the aftermath of profound disruption. In essence, the reconstruction of courthouses following the Civil War represents a slow, contemplative reassertion of authority, civic pride, and legal continuity. These buildings, emerging from the ruins of conflict, were deliberately crafted to be both functional and symbolic, reflecting the aspirations of communities determined to restore order, maintain continuity, and embody resilience. Through careful material selection, deliberate architectural planning, patient craftsmanship, and the meticulous orchestration of civic space, reconstructed courthouses communicated to citizens and visitors alike that the structures and processes of governance were enduring, reliable, and central to the rhythms of daily life. The slow, methodical restoration of courthouses thus became a quiet but powerful testament to the persistence of law, order, and civic identity in the American experience. As the 19th century progressed into its latter half and the 20th approached, County courthouses in the United States became increasingly influenced by broader national and international architectural movements, reflecting not only local aspiration but also the desire to communicate civic values through form, proportion, and ornamentation. Communities, slowly emerging from the disruptions of war and Reconstruction, approached courthouse design with deliberate care, selecting styles that could project dignity, stability, and permanence. The influence of neoclassical, Romanesque revival, and later Beaux Arts movements transformed the courthouse from a functional civic structure into a carefully curated symbol of governance, justice, and communal pride. Neoclassical architecture, with its disciplined emphasis on symmetry, proportion, and classical motifs derived from ancient Greece and Rome, began to assert a prominent influence on courthouses during the mid to late 19th century. Communities selected neoclassical elements, pediments, porticos, columns, pilasters, and entablatures, not merely for their aesthetic appeal but for the symbolic authority they conferred. Columns rising in measured intervals along the facade communicated a sense of order and permanence, echoing centuries-old associations of classical forms with rational governance and civic virtue. Porticos sheltered entrances while reinforcing the ceremonial approach to legal proceedings, signaling that those entering were participating in a structured, dignified, and enduring civic process. The courthouse, elevated slightly on a base or terrace, became a visual anchor within the town, asserting its centrality and authority without haste or ostentation, its rhythm deliberate, calm, and slow to unfold in the eye of the observer. Romanesque revival architecture emerged later in the century, particularly favored in counties seeking to convey solidity, strength, and resilience. Thick masonry walls, rounded arches, heavy stone lintels, and occasional turrets lent courthouses a fortress-like presence, emphasizing permanence in both material and symbolic terms. The movement, adapted from European precedents, was interpreted locally with restraint, balancing the dramatic effect of massive forms with the practical demands of interior courtroom spaces, clerical offices, and record storage. Communities carefully weighed the selection of stone, brick, and detailing, ensuring that each building conveyed authority and security while remaining accessible and functional. Rounded arches over entrances and windows created a sense of continuity and flow, guiding the visitor's perception gently and deliberately, while the careful articulation of mass and shadow communicated the endurance of legal and civic institutions. Toward the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, Beaux Arts architecture gained popularity, bringing with it a heightened sense of ceremonial grandeur, meticulous symmetry, and classical ornamentation. Courthouses influenced by Beaux Arts principles were designed to impress not with ostentation alone, but with carefully orchestrated formality, clarity, and measured hierarchy. Facades were adorned with sculptural reliefs, inscriptions, and decorative motifs that communicated civic ideals, while interiors were arranged to emphasize the orderly progression from public entry to courtroom observation and administrative offices. Central halls, often domed or coffered, allowed natural light to filter through, illuminating spaces in a calm, contemplative manner. Balconies, staircases, and elevated benches were carefully proportioned to reinforce both visual and functional hierarchy, allowing citizens to move through spaces in a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the measured pace of civic proceedings. The influence of these national architectural movements extended beyond mere style to the very sitting and orientation of courthouses. Communities considered both visibility and approach, ensuring that streets, squares, and surrounding structures highlighted the courthouse's centrality and symbolic authority. Landscaping, including open squares, pathways, and formal plantings, was integrated into the overall design to frame the building's presence, provide contemplative spaces for citizens, and reinforce the deliberate visual hierarchy of town planning. The Courthouse Square became a stage upon which architectural and civic ideals could slowly and methodically communicate their message, allowing residents and visitors to absorb meaning not in haste but through quiet observation and repeated interaction. The selection of architectural features was never arbitrary. Communities balanced aesthetic aspiration with functional necessity, ensuring that the building's form supported courtroom proceedings, record-keeping, and administrative tasks. Columns and arches provided both visual emphasis and structural support. Large windows allowed natural light to illuminate workspaces. Elevated floors and galleries facilitated observation and oversight. Ornamentation, from carved stone motifs to molded plaster detailing, was applied judiciously, enhancing dignity without overwhelming the purposeful clarity of space. In this way, architectural expression became inseparable from civic function, each design choice reinforcing the measured, deliberate character of courthouse life. Regional adaptations further nuanced the influence of these national styles. In the Midwest, where towns often expanded from grid-based plans and relatively flat terrain, courthouses incorporated elevated terraces, domed cupolas, and symmetrical facades to anchor the visual composition of the town center. In southern counties, courthouses integrated classical and Romanesque elements while accommodating expansive squares suitable for gatherings, markets, and public ceremonies. Material availability, climate considerations, and local craft traditions subtly shaped the final form of each building, resulting in a slow, regionally inflected expression of national architectural ideals. Each courthouse, though influenced by broader stylistic trends, retained a local rhythm, scale, and materiality that reflected the community's identity, priorities, and environmental context. The symbolic resonance of these architectural choices extended beyond aesthetics or practicality. Neoclassical, Romanesque revival, and Beaux-Arts forms communicated stability, permanence, and civic authority to citizens and visitors alike. Entering a courthouse, observing its balanced facade, ascending its measured steps, or moving through its spacious, carefully arranged interior was a subtle education in law, governance, and social hierarchy. The building itself, through deliberate proportions, ornamentation, and spatial organization, instructed participants in the rhythm, dignity, and enduring presence of civic institutions. Architectural form became pedagogy, a slow, contemplative lesson in the deliberate operation of government and law. In essence, the influence of national architectural movements on county courthouses demonstrates a careful balance of aspiration, symbolism, and practical function. Communities deliberately selected styles, materials, and design elements to project dignity, stability, and permanence, ensuring that the courthouse embodied both the authority of law and the deliberate rhythm of civic life. Through measured forms, restrained ornamentation, and thoughtful integration with town planning, these buildings communicated a slow, enduring narrative that governance, justice, and civic identity were constants in a changing world, steadily reinforced through the deliberate, visible articulation of architecture. The growth of counties across the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries followed a slow, measured rhythm, influenced by patterns of population migration, agricultural expansion, industrial development, and the gradual densification of towns and cities. As communities swelled and administrative demands increased, the role and physical presence of courthouses evolved accordingly. These structures, long symbols of legal authority and civic pride, were not static monuments. They were active participants in the adaptation of the county to changing demographic, economic, and social circumstances. The construction of new courthouses, the replacement of older ones, and the careful preservation of existing structures collectively created a layered landscape of historical architecture, reflecting decades of civic evolution in a deliberate, observable progression. Counties rarely expanded in isolation. Population growth, fueled by both migration from eastern states and the arrival of immigrants from abroad, gradually reshaped the demographic and spatial character of each jurisdiction. As settlements extended outward from town centers, previously sufficient courthouse buildings became inadequate in scale or function. Records multiplied, court dockets lengthened, and administrative offices required more space for clerks, tax collectors, and public officials. Communities responded slowly but deliberately, commissioning new courthouses designed to meet these growing demands, or enlarging and remodeling existing buildings to accommodate additional functions. This process was never hurried, rather it unfolded in careful stages, reflecting both the measured pace of population growth and the deliberate prioritization of civic investment. The replacement of older courthouses with newer structures illustrates the layering of architectural and historical narratives within a county. Early timber or modest brick buildings, constructed in the 18th or early 19th centuries, were often succeeded by larger, more elaborately designed courthouses, reflecting neoclassical, Romanesque revival, or Beaux Arts influences. Yet, remnants of earlier structures, whether incorporated into foundations, reused as materials, or preserved as historical markers, imbued the new buildings with a sense of continuity. Citizens walking through a county town could, with careful observation, trace the evolution of civic architecture and legal administration. The modest rectangular meeting house of the frontier era, the sturdier brick edifice of the early 1800s, and the grand ornamented courthouse of the post-Reconstruction period. Each layer of construction reflected both the pragmatic needs of governance and the symbolic desire to convey stability, permanence, and civic pride. As counties expanded geographically, the siting of courthouses became a deliberate exercise in accessibility and centrality. Planners and officials carefully considered population density, transportation routes, and topography, often situating courthouses near the geographic center of the county or along main thoroughfares connecting emerging towns. This careful positioning allowed the courthouse to function as both an administrative hub and a visual anchor, facilitating access for residents while maintaining its symbolic centrality within the community. The surrounding streets, squares and ancillary buildings, law offices, jails and public halls, were likewise integrated into the evolving spatial plan, creating a coherent urban or town fabric in which the courthouse remained the organizing principle. The growth of counties also necessitated expansion of the functional capacities of courthouses. Additional courtrooms were constructed to handle an increasing volume of civil and criminal cases, while office space for clerks, tax collectors, and administrative staff was enlarged to manage the complexity of governance. Storage facilities were adapted or expanded to accommodate the accumulation of legal documents, property records, and official correspondence. Even the design of circulation spaces, corridors, staircases, and entryways was carefully considered, allowing citizens, officials, and jurors to move through the building with measured order and decorum. The courthouse in these adaptations remained both a functional hub and a deliberate pedagogical space, teaching residents through spatial experience about hierarchy, civic responsibility, and the continuity of governance. Economic growth within counties was intimately connected with courthouse expansion. Construction of larger, more elaborate buildings provided employment for local artisans, laborers, and craftsmen, supporting regional economies in a measured and sustained manner. Brickmakers, stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths contributed their expertise over months or years, producing structures that were both materially durable and symbolically resonant. Local quarries and timber suppliers experienced increased demand, and the broader circulation of wages and contracts subtly strengthened the economic fabric of the county. In this way, courthouse construction was not simply an exercise in civic pride, it was a slow, deliberate engine of local economic and social continuity. As new courthouses rose, the historical layering of architectural styles became a defining feature of county towns. Walking through a courthouse square, a visitor could observe the progression of civic aesthetics and priorities over time. The modest symmetry and functional simplicity of early structures, the solidity and permanence conveyed by Romanesque revival masonry, and the ceremonial grandeur of Beaux Arts facades. This architectural stratification provided a visual narrative of the county's evolution, connecting past decisions, incremental growth, and successive waves of civic ambition. Each courthouse was a deliberate expression of its era, yet also part of a continuum, embedding the community's history within the material and spatial fabric of its public spaces. Population migration and settlement patterns further reinforced this layering. As new towns developed within counties, satellite courthouses or administrative annexes were sometimes constructed to improve access for dispersed populations. While smaller in scale, these secondary structures adhered to the architectural language and functional logic established by the central courthouse, ensuring consistency in both appearance and procedure. Over time, this network of courthouses created a deliberate and layered spatial rhythm across the county, reflecting demographic growth, administrative complexity, and the slow, methodical expansion of governance. The growth of counties also demanded adaptation in the symbolic and ceremonial role of courthouses. Larger buildings with prominent cupolas, pediments and porticos communicated the county's maturation, stability and confidence. Courthouse squares expanded to accommodate civic events, public gatherings and markets, reinforcing the courthouse's role as a social as well as a legal anchor. These developments were measured and intentional, emphasizing continuity over spectacle, permanence over novelty. Residents absorbed the lessons of civic identity through observation and participation, internalizing the courthouse as a slow, steady instrument of social cohesion. In essence, the expansion of counties and the construction of new courthouses represent a layered, deliberate narrative of civic growth. These buildings were more than functional structures. They were physical expressions of population change, economic development, and communal aspiration. Each courthouse, whether new or remodeled, contributed to a continuum of architectural and social meaning, embedding decades of governance, legal evolution, and community identity into the spatial and material fabric of the county. Through careful design, measured construction, and deliberate integration into town planning, the growth of courthouses mirrored the growth of counties themselves, patient, ordered, and enduring. Beyond their primary role as centers of law, administration, and record-keeping, county courthouses quietly anchored the social life of American communities. Their presence was both symbolic and practical, serving as subtle loci around which the rhythms of civic engagement, local tradition, and public discourse gradually unfolded. In towns large and small, the courthouse stood not only as a repository of governance, but as a measured, deliberate stage for the slow pulse of everyday communal existence, a heartbeat almost imperceptible, yet consistently present, regulating and observing the cadence of life around it. The courthouse square, whether expansive or modest, provided a spatial framework that encouraged gatherings, celebrations, and collective attention. Festivals, often tied to agricultural cycles, national holidays, or local commemorations, were oriented around the courthouse, its steps, porticos, and adjacent open areas serving as natural stages and meeting points. People gathered with quiet anticipation, exchanging news and greetings, observing ceremonies or parades, and experiencing in measured succession a rhythm of communal participation. The courthouse, while not the source of excitement or spectacle, subtly framed these events, establishing a setting in which the social fabric of the town could be reinforced through observation, interaction, and collective presence. Elections, both local and national, further emphasized the courthouse's understated role in social life. Voters assembled in orderly lines, consulting lists and registering their presence under the watchful oversight of clerks and officials. Citizens moving through the courthouse interior, or its adjacent spaces, absorbed the weight of civic responsibility through proximity and repetition. The deliberate organization of ballot boxes, the methodical processing of names, and the regulated flow of participants all reinforced the idea that democracy operated as a quiet, measured process. While excitement, debate, and occasional disagreement existed on the periphery, the courthouse itself remained a calm anchor, its architecture, steps, and public spaces silently instructing observers in the rhythms of participation, responsibility, and continuity. Public debates, town meetings, and assemblies further reinforced the courthouse's social significance. Whether convened to discuss taxation, road construction, school funding, or local ordinances, these gatherings took place under the measured auspices of the courthouse's formality. Citizens spoke, listened, and deliberated within spaces designed to facilitate both observation and order. Elevated benches, open halls, and structured seating arrangements created a subtle choreography of attention and authority. The courthouse in this sense mediated interaction, shaping the social experience of governance through its deliberate spatial organization. Over time, these interactions contributed to a tacit understanding of civic norms, demonstrating that social life, law, and governance were intertwined in slow, unremarkable, yet profound ways. Courthouses also supported informal social life. Markets occasionally spilled into surrounding squares, vendors set up stalls adjacent to the building, and townspeople exchanged news, gossip, and information, while conducting errands or attending court sessions. Children observed adults moving through these spaces, learning social hierarchies and behavioral expectations through observation rather than instruction. The courthouse, through its steady presence, became a stage upon which both formal and informal rhythms of life were enacted, quietly embedding communal norms, expectations, and interactions within the fabric of daily existence. The architecture and spatial organization of courthouses contributed to this subtle social function. Porticos and steps offered places for informal congregation, while surrounding squares provided room for both small and larger assemblies. Tree-lined avenues, benches, and open walkways created a measured environment in which citizens could move, pause, or linger with purpose or leisure. In many towns, the Courthouse Square was a visual and social reference point. Its cupola, or clock tower, could be seen from afar, guiding residents and visitors alike toward the center of civic life. This deliberate integration of building and landscape reinforced the courthouse as a social as well as administrative anchor, establishing a slow, observable pattern of interaction across the community. Seasonal and temporal rhythms also influenced courthouse-centered social life. In spring and summer, festivals, market days, and outdoor ceremonies made use of the open squares and shaded areas, while in autumn, civic commemorations and harvest-related gatherings reinforced communal bonds. Winter, often quieter, saw the courthouse continue to serve as a site for indoor gatherings, court sessions, and administrative interactions, preserving the continuity of social rhythms even when public assembly outside was limited by climate. The slow cadence of the seasons, measured against the steady presence of the courthouse, imparted a sense of permanence and predictability to communal life. The understated social role of courthouses also extended to quieter, more contemplative forms of interaction. Residents might pause on steps to converse, observe passing events, or reflect on public notices and proclamations posted on entryways. Clerks, judges, and officials, moving with careful attention to duty, became part of the rhythm of the space, their measured steps and predictable routines reinforcing a sense of stability. The courthouse, in this manner, orchestrated social life, not through spectacle or drama, but through constancy, subtle authority, and the steady repetition of daily routines. Moreover, courthouses facilitated the intergenerational transmission of social norms and civic awareness. Children accompanying parents, young adults observing public proceedings, and newcomers learning local customs all absorbed lessons in patience, order, and civic engagement. The architecture itself, with its structured form, deliberate pathways, and visual hierarchy, contributed to this education, communicating through space and materiality what words alone could not. Residents learned slowly and unconsciously that civic life was measured, deliberate, and sustained by collective participation within defined spaces. In essence, the courthouse functioned as a silent conductor of the social rhythms of the county. While festivals, elections, debates, and informal gatherings drew citizens into its orbit, the building itself maintained a measured, deliberate presence that regulated these activities with subtle authority. Its architecture, steps, and surrounding square provided a steady backdrop for human interaction, shaping the community's social experience in ways that were rarely noticed but consistently influential. Over decades, the courthouse became an almost imperceptible heartbeat within the town, its steady pulse synchronizing legal, civic, and social life into a coherent, enduring rhythm. Thus, the understated social role of courthouses reveals the profound ways in which architecture, space, and civic planning intersected with daily life. By providing a stable, deliberate environment for public assembly, informal interaction, and the transmission of communal norms, these buildings quietly guided the rhythms of social existence. The courthouse, though often approached with formality and purpose, also nurtured the slow, unremarkable processes through which community cohesion, civic awareness, and social continuity were maintained, rendering it both a center of law and a steady, subtle heartbeat in the life of a county. As the 20th century unfolded, the United States experienced a profound transformation in technology, infrastructure, and societal organization, changes that rippled into every aspect of civic life. County courthouses, long established as anchors of legal authority, social rhythm, and civic identity, were not immune to this slow wave of modernization. Yet, rather than abandoning their symbolic and architectural heritage, these buildings carefully integrated new materials, technologies, and functional improvements, creating a deliberate balance between the enduring symbolism of governance and the practical demands of contemporary life. This careful blending of modernity with tradition unfolded in a measured, almost contemplative progression, reflecting both technological optimism and a reverence for the historical gravitas of civic architecture. The introduction of modern materials represented one of the earliest and most visible manifestations of 20th century adaptation. Steel, reinforced concrete, and structural glass were gradually incorporated alongside traditional masonry, timber, and stone. These materials allowed for larger interior spaces, longer spans without supporting columns, and improved durability, accommodating expanding administrative needs, while maintaining a sense of architectural dignity. The use of steel framing, for instance, permitted higher ceilings, more expansive courtrooms, and flexible office layouts for clerks, judges, and public officials. Reinforced concrete offered resistance to fire, decay, and the environmental stresses that had challenged earlier generations of buildings, particularly those constructed of wood or simple brick. Even as these modern materials were employed, care was taken to maintain stylistic continuity, often by cladding steel frames with stone or brick facades, preserving the classical or Romanesque motifs that had long communicated civic authority and stability. Electricity brought a subtler, yet equally transformative, influence. Lighting, once dependent on candles, oil lamps, or natural daylight, now illuminated courtrooms, halls, and offices with even reliable brightness. Stairwells, corridors, and public entryways became safer and more navigable, while exterior illumination highlighted facades and cupolas during evening hours, subtly reinforcing the courthouse's symbolic presence within the community. Electrical infrastructure also enabled the installation of heating systems, elevators, and mechanical clocks, allowing buildings to function comfortably and efficiently in ways that had previously been impractical. These technological enhancements did not seek to dominate the architectural narrative, rather they were carefully integrated to support functionality, while allowing the measured rhythm of civic life to continue undisturbed. The modernization of courthouses extended beyond materials and infrastructure to embrace procedural and administrative efficiency. With the rise of bureaucracy, increased documentation, and the complexities of taxation, civil law, and regulatory oversight, courthouses required expanded office space, organized filing systems, and technological support for clerks and officials. Telephones, mechanical copying devices, and early forms of typewriting transformed the manner in which administrative work was conducted, accelerating communication while maintaining the deliberate cadence of record-keeping. Court proceedings, although benefiting from these efficiencies, retained a measured and formal rhythm, as judges, jurors, and clerks adhered to the procedural conventions that had long defined civic order. Technology enhanced capacity, but did not replace the slow contemplative processes that grounded the legitimacy of local governance. Architectural evolution during this period maintained a careful dialogue with historical forms. While functional enhancements necessitated new design considerations, communities remained committed to preserving visual continuity with earlier courthouse aesthetics. Classical porticos, cupolas, pediments, and symmetrical facades were retained or subtly adapted to modern materials and construction techniques. Interior spaces balanced practical layout needs with ceremonial clarity. Elevated judicial benches, organized clerk offices, and clear circulation paths preserved the pedagogical and symbolic dimensions of courthouse architecture. In this way, modernization did not imply abandonment of tradition, rather it reflected a deliberate synthesis, where technological progress was harmonized with enduring architectural language, ensuring that the courthouse remained both a functional hub and a visible emblem of civic identity. The 20th century also introduced infrastructure improvements that influenced courthouse placement, accessibility, and connectivity. Roads, bridges, and public transportation networks allowed residents from more distant areas to reach the county seat efficiently, reinforcing the courthouse's role as a central hub of governance. Parking areas and pedestrian pathways were gradually incorporated into courthouse squares, blending modern convenience with historical spatial organization. Landscape design continued to emphasize visual hierarchy and deliberate spatial rhythm, with trees, benches, and open plazas maintaining the contemplative quality of the courthouse environment. Each infrastructural change was thoughtfully integrated, respecting the building's symbolic primacy, while accommodating the practical realities of a more mobile and technologically connected population. Modernization was also reflected in the incorporation of municipal services and secondary functions. Courthouses increasingly housed offices for emerging civic departments, legal aid and public records, creating a multifunctional center that mirrored the complexity of contemporary governance. Mechanical systems for climate control, fire safety, and communications were quietly integrated into walls and ceilings, ensuring operational efficiency without disturbing the visual or ceremonial qualities of the space. This careful orchestration of utility and symbolism allowed the courthouse to adapt to changing administrative demands while preserving the sense of permanence and gravitas that had long defined its presence. The symbolic significance of modernization was subtle yet profound, as communities witnessed the blending of historical architecture with modern materials, technologies, and infrastructure. Residents internalized a quiet lesson that governance, law, and civic identity could evolve without losing continuity. Courthouses communicated not only authority and tradition, but adaptability and foresight. The deliberate pacing of technological integration mirrored the slow rhythm of civic life, reassuring citizens that change could be incremental, controlled, and harmonious rather than abrupt or disruptive. Throughout the century, courthouses continued to mediate social, civic, and legal life with the same understated authority that had characterized them for generations. Public gatherings, elections, markets, and festivals continued to unfold around the courthouse square, now enhanced by lighting, paved pathways, and improved amenities. Citizens moved through these spaces at a measured pace, observing, participating, and absorbing the rhythms of communal life in a steady, unhurried manner. Modernization had expanded capacity, enhanced comfort, and improved safety, yet the courthouse remained a calm, contemplative anchor, guiding civic behavior through both symbolic presence and deliberate spatial orchestration. In essence, the modernization of courthouses in the 20th century represents a careful, deliberate balancing act integrating technological, material, and infrastructural advances while preserving architectural symbolism, civic function, and social rhythm. The buildings retained their capacity to anchor legal processes, administrative functions, and public life, while adapting to the evolving realities of an industrialized, interconnected society. The result is a layered, continuous narrative of civic architecture, a slow, measured progression in which modernity and tradition coexist, reinforcing the enduring legitimacy, authority, and quiet presence of the county courthouse within the life of the community. As the 20th century progressed, and particularly following the disruptions and transformations of industrialization, urbanization, and modernization, communities across the United States began to cultivate a more deliberate awareness of their own history and the physical markers that embodied it. County courthouses, with their slow accumulation of architectural, civic, and social significance, emerged as focal points for this reflection. No longer merely functional centers for law, administration, and social gatherings, courthouses were increasingly recognized as tangible repositories of memory, identity, and civic continuity. This awareness inspired careful preservation, measured interventions, and the rise of historical consciousness that encouraged citizens to pause, observe, and consider the layered narratives embodied in these enduring structures. The early preservation movement often grew out of local historical societies, which meticulously documented the evolution of civic institutions, architectural forms, and community rituals. These societies, composed of citizens, scholars, and officials, undertook deliberate surveys of county buildings, collecting photographs, architectural drawings, and records that chronicled the development of the courthouse across decades or even centuries. Their work was slow, methodical, and highly detailed, reflecting a belief that historical knowledge required careful attention, patience, and reverent observation. Courthouses, as central nodes of civic life, naturally drew focus. They embodied decisions about governance, reflected aesthetic and material choices across generations, and served as silent witnesses to the rhythms of public life, elections, festivals, and communal interaction. Preservation efforts often began with recognition of vulnerability, aging materials, environmental wear, and the pressures of modernization threatened both structural integrity and historical authenticity. Communities undertook painstaking studies to identify areas of structural weakness, material degradation, or architectural alteration that might compromise the building's original character. Stonework, timber framing, brick facades, and decorative elements were evaluated individually, and interventions were often staged incrementally, ensuring that each action preserved as much historical material and visual continuity as possible. Preservation, in this sense, became a slow, deliberate conversation between past and present. Each repair, restoration, or adaptive reuse required careful attention to historical evidence, community values, and functional necessity. Historical consciousness was reinforced through documentation, education, and public engagement. Plaques, exhibits, and guided tours allowed citizens and visitors alike to appreciate the courthouse not only as a site of legal and civic activity, but as a living archive of community memory. Seasonal festivals, heritage days, and commemorative events often emphasized the courthouse as a locus of collective reflection, inviting residents to engage in measured contemplation of their town's evolution, the ebb and flow of legal and social norms, and the subtle, enduring presence of governance across generations. In this way, preservation was both practical and pedagogical. It ensured the survival of material structures while fostering a slow, reflective engagement with civic and communal identity. The architecture of courthouses facilitated this contemplative engagement. Pediments, cupolas, porticos, and arches were appreciated not only for their aesthetic qualities, but as visual markers of historical eras and stylistic transitions. Citizens could observe the layering of architectural influences, from early neoclassical simplicity to Romanesque revival solidity to Beaux-Arts grandeur, tracing the evolution of both material choice and communal aspiration. Each feature, measured in its proportions, spacing, and ornamentation, provided a quiet narrative of civic priorities, technological capability, and social values. The courthouse, in essence, became a slow-reading text, one in which the past could be discerned and understood by careful, unhurried observation, contemplation, and reflection. Preservation extended beyond physical architecture to encompass records, interior furnishings, and functional apparatus. Court dockets, land registries, clerical documents, and ceremonial artifacts were catalogued, protected, and when necessary restored, ensuring that the administrative heartbeat of the county remained intelligible and accessible. Interiors were often maintained with a deliberate balance, while functional updates were sometimes required to accommodate contemporary administrative needs. Care was taken to preserve historical finishes, original woodwork, decorative plaster, and furniture that reflected past epochs. This measured integration of old and new allowed courthouses to remain operational centers of governance, while simultaneously serving as archives of memory and continuity. The broader cultural implications of courthouse preservation were significant. In towns across the nation, the visible endurance of these buildings fostered a slow, pervasive sense of continuity and identity. Residents could trace familial, civic, and legal histories across generations, observing how decisions, disputes, and civic projects had unfolded within the same physical space. The courthouse, standing quietly at the heart of the community, embodied both the authority of law and the cumulative narrative of communal experience. By preserving these structures, communities created a deliberate reflective dialogue with their past, one in which the rhythms of daily life, the accumulation of civic memory, and the endurance of social order were slow, contemplative, and profoundly instructive. Historic preservation also intersected with public policy and legal frameworks. By mid-century, various state and national initiatives, including the National Register of Historic Places, provided guidelines, recognition, and sometimes funding to support the careful maintenance and protection of courthouses deemed historically significant. Communities, guided by both local pride and formal regulatory mechanisms, undertook projects to stabilize aging structures, restore original facades, and conserve interior spaces, often consulting architectural historians and preservation specialists. The work was meticulous and deliberate. Every intervention aimed to maintain authenticity, ensure structural integrity, and preserve the symbolic and functional role of the courthouse within the social fabric of the county. Through preservation, the courthouse became a site of slow pedagogy, where citizens could internalize lessons about the passage of time, the endurance of civic structures, and the subtle continuity of governance. It encouraged measured reflection, offering spaces in which individuals could pause, observe, and consider the interplay of law, architecture, social life, and history. Courthouse Squares, restored interiors, and preserved records collectively facilitated a contemplative engagement with the past, embedding the rhythms of civic memory into the material environment of everyday life. In essence, the rise of historical awareness and preservation efforts underscores the dual nature of the courthouse, both as a functioning center of law and administration, and as a deliberate reflective repository of communal memory. By recognizing and safeguarding these structures, communities ensured that the slow, cumulative narratives of governance, social life, and architectural evolution were not lost to time. The courthouse, in this context, stands as a measured dialogue between past and present, offering a quiet, contemplative space in which citizens may reflect on continuity, identity, and the enduring pulse of civic life. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, county courthouses continued to occupy a central, deliberate role in the civic, legal, and social life of American communities, even as architectural tastes, construction technologies, and administrative requirements evolved. The contemporary landscape of courthouses is marked by a diverse interplay of modernist buildings, restored historic structures, and adaptive reuse projects, each reflecting the ongoing negotiation between tradition and innovation. Yet, despite these variations, a slow, unbroken continuity persists. Courthouses remain anchors of law, civic order, and communal rhythm, their presence quietly structuring the daily lives and social consciousness of towns and counties across the nation. Modernist courthouses, which emerged primarily in the mid to late 20th century, often prioritize functionality, minimal ornamentation, and clarity of spatial organization. Their facades, frequently characterized by rectilinear forms, large expanses of glass, and unadorned concrete or steel, convey transparency and rationality, rather than ceremonial grandeur. Yet, even in their apparent simplicity, these buildings are carefully calibrated to maintain the courthouse's symbolic authority. Entrances are deliberately defined, public circulation is methodically organized, and interior spaces, including courtrooms, offices, and clerical areas, are designed to facilitate orderly movement, procedural clarity, and the measured rhythms of legal and administrative activity. The architectural austerity of modernist design does not diminish civic presence. Instead, it channels authority through spatial logic, proportion, and the quiet, deliberate choreography of human activity. Restored historic courthouses remain equally prominent in the contemporary landscape. Communities, often guided by historical societies, preservationists, and municipal planning boards, have undertaken extensive restoration projects to maintain both the structural integrity and symbolic significance of older buildings. Cupolas, pediments, porticos, and masonry detailing are repaired, conserved, or carefully replicated, preserving the visual and architectural narratives that link present-day civic life to earlier eras. Interior spaces are sometimes adapted to contemporary needs, modern lighting, accessibility improvements, climate control, and technology integration, yet these interventions are executed with sensitivity to historical character. The result is a subtle, layered dialogue between past and present. The courthouse continues to serve as a functional center of governance, while simultaneously embodying decades or even centuries of civic memory, social rhythm, and architectural evolution. Adaptive reuse also characterizes contemporary courthouse practice. Some counties have expanded existing courthouses with new wings, annexes, or connected administrative buildings, creating a cohesive complex that accommodates modern operational needs without erasing historical identity. In these cases, the new structures are often deliberately contrasted, or harmonized with the original building's aesthetic, creating a dialogue in which modern materials, energy-efficient systems, and contemporary spatial arrangements coexist with classical or Romanesque forms. Visitors, jurors, and officials navigating such complexes experience both continuity and adaptation. The deliberate pacing of spatial movement, the visual prominence of central architectural features, and the ceremonial gravitas of courtrooms are preserved, while modern amenities enhance function and comfort. The contemporary Courthouse Square, too, reflects the evolving interface between civic function and social life. Open plazas, landscaped grounds, and pedestrian-friendly walkways continue to provide spaces for public gatherings, festivals, markets, and casual congregation. Even when adjacent streets are widened for automobile traffic, or parking lots are introduced for practicality, careful planning often maintains sightlines, centrality, and visual hierarchy, ensuring that the courthouse remains a focal point of the town or county. Trees, benches, fountains, and lighting are incorporated with attention to rhythm, scale, and proportionality, reinforcing the courthouse's symbolic and social anchoring while accommodating the evolving needs of contemporary life. Functionally, contemporary courthouses continue to sustain the same core rhythms established over centuries: the methodical processing of cases, the careful preservation and management of records, the formal conduct of elections, and the orchestration of civic ceremonies. Clerks, judges, and officials perform their duties within spaces deliberately arranged to facilitate observation, order, and procedural clarity. Public participants, citizens attending court sessions, jurors arriving to fulfill their obligations, or individuals consulting records, move through these spaces according to established routines, absorbing, often unconsciously, the steady measured cadence of legal and administrative life. These subtle, enduring rhythms connect contemporary practice to a lineage of civic behavior that extends back through Reconstruction, the expansion of counties, and even the earliest colonial meetinghouses. The endurance of courthouses within the contemporary landscape underscores their symbolic significance. Regardless of stylistic variation or technological sophistication, each courthouse communicates authority, permanence, and civic identity. Modernist transparency, historical ornamentation, or hybrid adaptive forms all articulate, in measured ways, the principle that governance, law, and civic engagement are constants amidst social, technological, and demographic change. Citizens encountering these buildings experience continuity, a visual and spatial assertion that local government, legal processes, and communal life are deliberate, stable, and accessible. This continuity is further reinforced through deliberate preservation of ritual, ceremony, and tradition. Courthouse squares remain sites for civic commemoration, festivals, public readings of proclamations, and the observance of elections. Architectural features such as steps, porticos, and central halls continue to provide stages for public interaction, guiding social behavior and reinforcing communal norms. Even in modernist or newly constructed courthouses, the underlying organization of space, the distinction between public, administrative, and ceremonial areas, maintains a measured, formalized rhythm, connecting contemporary civic experience to centuries of precedent. In essence, contemporary courthouses exemplify the careful balance between adaptation and continuity. They absorb technological, aesthetic, and functional innovations while retaining the deliberate, measured rhythms that have long defined the courthouse as a central instrument of civic life. Whether modernist, restored historic, or adaptively reused, these buildings embody a persistent narrative, the endurance of law, social order, and community identity. Amidst the gradual evolution of society, the courthouse remains, in quiet and deliberate terms, a heartbeat of the county, its presence linking past, present, and future through a slow, contemplative continuity that shapes both the physical landscape and the lived experience of civic life. Across centuries, county courthouses have served as far more than functional centers of law and administration. Their presence in towns and counties resonates as a quiet, enduring testament to stability, permanence, and civic pride. They occupy a unique intersection of architecture, social life, and historical continuity, standing as deliberate witnesses to countless human experiences unfolding within and around their walls. From the earliest colonial meeting houses and rudimentary structures to modernist, adaptive, or restored edifices, the courthouse consistently embodies a calm, contemplative authority, a silent observer of human endeavor and societal rhythm. The symbolic power of the courthouse lies first in its architectural presence. Elevated steps, symmetrical facades, cupolas, pediments and porticos, whether rendered in neoclassical, Romanesque revival, Beaux Arts, or modernist forms, convey order, gravitas, and careful deliberation. Each line, proportion, and decorative element was selected with intention, subtly instructing visitors, residents, and officials alike in the primacy of law, civic process, and collective responsibility. Even the quietest observer approaching a courthouse square absorbs lessons of measured authority and social hierarchy. The building teaches by presence rather than instruction, its slow, deliberate formality imparting a sense of stability across generations. Inside, courthouses serve as theaters of countless human dramas, each proceeding in its own unhurried rhythm. Civil disputes, criminal trials, property registrations, tax proceedings, and other administrative matters unfold with the quiet deliberation that defines legal process. Judges preside over proceedings with measured gestures, clerks maintain meticulous records, and jurors carry out their duties with attention and restraint. Over decades, centuries even, these interiors have witnessed reconciliations, disagreements, the resolution of conflicts, and the affirmation of civic norms. Every hearing, every decision, and every administrative act contributes to a cumulative rhythm, a subtle hum of governance and social order, observed silently by the building itself. The courthouse also embodies continuity in a tangible, almost tactile sense. While communities change, populations grow, migrations occur, economies shift, and new technologies emerge, the courthouse endures. Stone, brick, timber, and steel accumulate patina, weather, and repair, yet the spatial and symbolic essence remains remarkably stable. Its presence communicates to residents and visitors alike that despite change and uncertainty, the structures of governance, the principles of law, and the rituals of civic participation persist. In this sense, the courthouse functions as both anchor and lens, allowing successive generations to interpret continuity in civic life, to observe the unfolding of human experience against the steady backdrop of institutional permanence. Courthouses are also repositories of small-scale historical memory. All while national narratives focus on wars, treaties, and large-scale transformations, the courthouse preserves the quieter, incremental histories of communities, property transfers, local elections, family disputes, business agreements, and civic ceremonies. These cumulative moments, individually unremarkable, but collectively profound, trace the evolution of society in tangible terms. The courthouse as silent witness, records and mediates these interactions, embedding them within walls, archives, and staircases, allowing the building to become a repository of lived experience. In this way, every corner, hallway, and courtroom is imbued with layered memory, carrying echoes of past human deliberations, reconciliations, and social interactions. The surrounding courthouse square enhances this symbolic role. Open spaces, shaded avenues, and thoughtfully arranged landscaping frame the building as a deliberate focal point of town life. Residents pause on benches, children observe procedural order, and citizens move through the square with purpose and awareness. Market days, festivals, parades, and public announcements occur within this carefully delineated environment, embedding the courthouse into the social and sensory landscape of the community. Even when life seems mundane or repetitive, the building silently contextualizes events, linking daily activity to enduring civic values. Courthouses also function as markers of communal pride. Their construction, often funded through local taxation, labor contributions, or civic initiative, reflects collective investment in governance and social cohesion. The deliberate attention to architectural detail, durability of materials, and placement within the town conveys intentionality, signaling that the community values stability, law, and shared identity. This pride is quiet, cumulative, and persistent, manifesting in careful maintenance, restoration efforts, and ongoing use rather than spectacle. The courthouse does not demand attention through flash or ornament. Its authority is measured, observed in the habitual engagement of citizens with its presence and functions. Beyond architecture and function, the courthouse serves as a contemplative instrument. Observers approaching or entering may feel the slow cadence of civic life, structured by human decision-making and reflected in the deliberate layout and spatial organization of the building. The central hall, courtroom galleries, entry porticos, and administrative offices guide movement and behavior with subtle authority, reinforcing norms, hierarchy, and the rhythm of civic engagement. Residents internalize these lessons unconsciously, their behaviors shaped by architecture as much as by social convention or law. The courthouse in this sense teaches not through proclamation, but through calibrated spatial experience, a quiet instructor in the processes of collective life. Finally, the courthouse stands as a temporal bridge. Its walls, materials, and design elements link the earliest foundations of county governance to contemporary civic practices. Even as administrative systems evolve, population dynamics shift, and technological tools transform daily operations, the courthouse embodies enduring principles of justice, social order, and communal engagement. Its symbolic presence allows residents to perceive the past within the present, to see how previous generations organized governance, conducted social life, and expressed civic identity, and to recognize the persistence of these rhythms in their own experience. In essence, courthouses are deliberate, quiet symbols. They are more than buildings. They are repositories of law, memory, and social rhythm. They witness human life unfolding in all its ordinariness and significance, silently observing disputes resolved, agreements reached, and communities nurtured. They communicate stability, permanence, and civic pride through architectural form, spatial organization, and unbroken presence. Above all, the courthouse embodies a slow, contemplative rhythm of civic life, offering citizens and visitors alike a tangible, enduring link to the principles, values, and experiences that shape their communities. In the quiet sweep of American history, county courthouses stand as enduring witnesses to the slow unfolding of civic life, law, and social order. They are neither dramatic nor sensational, rather they embody a measured, deliberate constancy that has quietly shaped communities, guided the rhythms of everyday life, and anchored the processes of governance across centuries. From the earliest colonial meetinghouses through post-revolution reconstruction, through the stylistic flourishes of the 19th century, and into the modernist and restored structures of today, the courthouse has remained a deliberate instrument of civic identity, its presence signaling stability, authority, and communal continuity in ways that transcend the immediacy of human events. The legacy of county courthouses lies first in their architectural and symbolic constancy. Each courthouse, regardless of era, communicates a deliberate message that governance is orderly, law is enduring, and communal life is structured by both procedural and spatial logic. Early wood and brick structures reflected modest means but precise intent. Post-revolution edifices expanded in scale and ambition, incorporating classical elements to convey permanence and civic pride. 19th century courthouses, with cupolas, porticos, and Romanesque ornamentation, further emphasized authority, durability, and social centrality. Modernist and restored courthouses continue this lineage, integrating technological improvements, functional efficiency, and contemporary stylistic choices without abandoning the symbolic clarity established over centuries. In each era, the courthouse serves as a deliberate visual and spatial anchor, a calm, constant presence guiding residents in their civic awareness. Beyond architecture, courthouses have consistently mediated social and civic life. Their role as sites for elections, public debates, community announcements, festivals, and informal gatherings demonstrates a subtle, measured influence on the rhythm of towns and counties. Residents, moving through courthouse squares, ascending steps, or pausing on porticos, absorb lessons in civic behavior, responsibility, and collective participation without ceremony or spectacle. The courthouse teaches through presence, order, and repeated experience. the measured cadence of human activity within and around its walls instills a sense of continuity, reinforcing social norms and communal identity. Over time, these accumulated interactions, both formal and informal, form a layer of cultural memory, embedding the courthouse deeply within the lived experience of communities. The legacy of courthouses is also evident in the preservation of history and memory. Historical societies, preservationists and local governments have long recognized that these buildings are not merely functional spaces but repositories of collective memory. By safeguarding architectural features, documenting procedural evolution, and maintaining records of civic activity, communities ensure that successive generations can trace the slow, deliberate arc of local governance. Courthouses encapsulate the quiet histories of property transfers, legal disputes, elections, festivals, and everyday interactions, providing a tangible record of the human and civic experience across decades and centuries. In this way, the building itself becomes an archive, a slow contemplative narrative, readable not in words alone, but in steps, staircases, hallways and facades. Equally important is the courthouse's role in shaping perceptions of law and authority. Its very presence communicates stability and continuity, conveying to residents and visitors alike that the structures of governance endure even amid social change, technological innovation, or demographic transformation. The courthouse reassures by its constancy, asserting that civic procedures, legal frameworks and communal norms remain intact, available for navigation and engagement in an ordered, measured fashion. Its symbolic authority is reinforced not through ostentation or coercion, but through the quiet repetition of presence, the deliberate orchestration of space, and the careful maintenance of civic and architectural integrity. Economic, social, and cultural patterns have also been subtly shaped by the courthouse's presence. Construction, maintenance, and adaptive reuse projects have provided steady work for local artisans, laborers, architects, and planners. Courthouse squares have influenced town layouts, commercial activity, and the spatial organization of civic services. The measured integration of courthouses into towns reflects a long-term commitment to planning, aesthetic harmony, and social cohesion. Each building, in its materials, design, and setting, reinforces an intricate network of relationships between community, governance, and daily life, illustrating the profound yet understated legacy of civic architecture. The courthouse is further a symbol of intergenerational continuity. Children and young adults, observing the measured order of court proceedings, the flow of public activity, and the deliberate orchestration of space, internalize lessons in civic behavior and communal responsibility. Citizens returning year after year experience both change and stability. Laws, officials, and administrative systems evolve, yet the courthouse remains a constant reference point, embodying the enduring principles that guide communal life. This temporal continuity strengthens social memory, instills respect for law and governance, and fosters a sense of shared identity across generations. Modern preservation, adaptive use, and architectural continuity ensure that courthouses remain relevant in contemporary life, while preserving the lessons of the past. Even as new materials, accessibility features, digital records, and technological systems are incorporated, the core functions, spatial clarity, and symbolic authority remain intact. The courthouse continues to anchor civic life, embodying a measured balance between historical memory and modern necessity. Its presence communicates, subtly and consistently, that law, governance, and community are enduring, deliberate in pace, reflecting the rhythms that have shaped the county for generations. Ultimately, the legacy of county courthouses is a composite of architecture, civic function, social rhythm, and historical memory. They stand as deliberate witnesses to the slow passage of time, observing the resolution of disputes, the marking of agreements, the celebration of festivals, and the measured rhythms of daily life. They provide continuity amid change, order amid uncertainty, and a tangible connection to the civic principles that have sustained communities over centuries. In every town, in every county, the courthouse serves as a quiet testament to the enduring values of law, governance, and communal cohesion, a subtle yet constant heartbeat that links past, present, and future. In this reflective and measured way, county courthouses achieve their most enduring legacy, not as monuments of grandeur, nor as sites of spectacle, but as steady, deliberate anchors of civic life. Their presence reassures, instructs, and witnesses, embodying continuity, authority, and communal identity across generations. They are, in every sense, the quiet and enduring custodians of local history, law, and societal rhythm, standing patiently at the center of American communities as symbols of stability, order, and reflective permanence.